Hey everyone, welcome to East Park. Today I want to argue that Eric Cartman is not just the most controversial character in the history of animated television. He is, when examined through the cold and unforgiving lens of the law, one of the most comprehensively criminal figures ever put on screen. Not because he is loud or selfish or offensive in the ways that South Park is famous for, but because underneath all of that, there is a pattern of behavior that covers almost every serious category of crime that exists. Murder, false imprisonment, deliberate infection, child exploitation, armed robbery, organized hatred, defamation, obstruction of justice, and the direction of a world-ending force towards civilian populations. 10-year-old, 4th grade, South Park Elementary, and a legal file that most career criminals never come close to building. Today we are going to sit with a lawyer and go through every single case. We are going to look at what actually happened, what the charges would be, and what it all means when you add it up from the beginning to the end. But before we do that, I would just like to kindly ask you to subscribe if you have not already. It is completely free and it genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Alright, the court is in session, let us begin. Premeditated murder. The Scott Tenerman case. If you were a lawyer sitting across from Eric Cartman, the very first thing you would do is open a file labeled Scott Tenerman. Not because it was his first crime, not because it was the smallest thing he ever did, but because it is the clearest, cleanest example of who Eric Cartman actually is underneath all the tantrums and manipulation. This is the case that removes every possible excuse. There is no impulse, there is no accident, there is no moment where you can look at what happened and say he didn't know what he was doing. The Scott Tenerman case is a story about a 10-year-old boy who planned the murder of 2 adults over a period of weeks, carried it out without hesitation, and then celebrated while their son cried over what he had just eaten. And a lawyer looking at this case would not need to search very hard for charges. They would be stacked so high, the paperwork alone would take a week to sort through. It started as most of Cartman's worst moments do, with something completely small. Scott Tenerman was a 9th grader at South Park who sold Cartman a small bag of his own pubic hair for $10. He convinced Cartman that buying pubic hair was how you entered puberty, and Cartman, believing he had just taken his first real step into growing up, proudly paid for it. When Cartman found out he had been tricked, he was humiliated. Not just embarrassed, truly, deeply humiliated in a way that he could not let go of. To Cartman, the $10 was not the issue. The issue was that Scott had made him look stupid in front of other people. Scott had laughed at him, and from the moment that happened, Cartman began building a plan. What followed was a series of failed attempts to get revenge. Cartman tried to train a pony named Little Clyde to bite off Scott's private part. He rehearsed it. He prepared for it. But Scott found out, turned the plan around, and had the pony trained to attack Cartman instead. He then filmed the entire incident and showed it to the whole town, laughing as Cartman was publicly humiliated all over again. For most people, this would be the end of it. You lost. You got humiliated twice. You move on, but Cartman did not move on. He went quiet, and that silence was the most dangerous thing about him. A lawyer examining this case would point to what happened next as the moment that separates childish revenge fantasies from genuine criminal planning. Cartman did not lash out. He did not react. He sat down and thought. He researched. He constructed a plan that had multiple moving parts, required the cooperation of people who had no idea what they were actually helping with, and depended entirely on Cartman knowing exactly how each person involved would behave. This is what lawyers call premeditation. It means you thought about it before you did it. It means there was a gap, sometimes hours, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, between the decision to act and the act itself. In Cartman's case, that gap was filled with preparation so detailed that when the day finally came, everything worked exactly the way he had planned. Here is what Cartman actually did. He found out that Farmer Jenkins, a local farmer, had a well-known rule on his property. Anyone who trespassed on his farm would be shot. This was not a secret. This was something people in the area knew. Cartman knew it, and he used it. He reached out to Scott's parents, Jack and Linda Tenerman, and through manipulation and misdirection, he arranged for them to sneak onto Farmer Jenkins's farm to look for Little Clyde, the pony. They believed they had a legitimate reason to be there. They had no idea that Cartman had set the entire thing up. Farmer Jenkins, acting exactly as Cartman knew he would, found them trespassing and shot and killed them both. Jack and Linda Tenerman were dead, and Cartman had caused it without ever touching a weapon. A lawyer would spend considerable time on this exact point because it is where the legal case becomes especially serious. Cartman did not pull a trigger. He never laid a hand on either of Scott's parents, but that does not matter under the law. When you deliberately place someone in a situation you know will result in their death, when you use another person as a weapon without that person knowing they are being used, you are still responsible for what happened. This is called felony murder in many places, and in others it falls under first-degree murder because the planning proves you intended the outcome. Cartman knew Farmer Jenkins shot trespassers. He arranged for Jack and Linda to trespass. The deaths were not a surprise to him. They were the plan, but Cartman did not stop there. What came next is the part that makes even the most experienced lawyers pause when they read through this case. After Jack and Linda Tenerman were shot and killed, Cartman took their bodies. He ground their remains into meat. He cooked that meat into chili. And he brought that chili to the South Park ChiliCon Carnival, where he served it to Scott Tenerman, Scott's parents, in a bowl handed to their own son, while Scott had no idea what he was eating. Every part of that sentence is a separate crime. Taking the bodies of people who have died, regardless of how they died, without legal authority is illegal. Transporting human remains without authorization is illegal. Processing and cooking human remains is a violation of laws that exist in every single American state. Serving human remains to another person, knowingly and without their knowledge or consent, is one of the most severe charges a prosecutor could bring. And doing all of it as part of a calculated plan to cause emotional devastation to a child is the kind of thing that ends up in law school case studies, not because it happens often, but because it is so complete in its cruelty that it forces everyone reading it to ask how the legal system would even begin to respond. At the ChiliCon Carnival, Scott ate the chili, and then Cartman revealed what he had done. He had arranged for Radiohead, and Scott's favorite band, to be there in person, not to perform, not to celebrate, but specifically to watch Scott cry and call him a crybaby. Scott broke down completely when he realized what he had just eaten. He sobbed, he collapsed, he was destroyed. And Cartman stood over him, leaned down, and licked the tears off his face, saying the words that anyone who has ever watched this episode has never been able to forget. He told Scott his tears were sweet. He savored them. He had planned for this moment just as carefully as he had planned every other part of it. From a legal standpoint, this moment matters too. It is evidence of what lawyers call consciousness of guilt. Cartman was not shocked by what happened. He was not scared. He did not run or try to hide what he had done. He celebrated it. He had arranged an audience for it. He had brought Scott's favorite band specifically to maximize the pain. This kind of behavior, presented to a jury, would eliminate any argument that Cartman was acting impulsively or without full understanding of what he was doing. The celebration proves the intent. The preparation proves the premeditation. The outcome proves the result. So what would the actual charges look like? A lawyer building this case from the ground up would start with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The premeditation is documented in the episode itself. Cartman's plan was detailed enough that he accounted for how Farmer Jenkins would react, how Scott's parents would respond to his manipulation, and what Scott's emotional state would be at the reveal. 2 people are dead because of decisions Cartman made over a long period of time. First-degree murder, twice over, then you add criminal conspiracy. Cartman did not act entirely alone. He manipulated Farmer Jenkins, Scott's parents, and the members of Radiohead into playing roles in his plan, even if none of them understood what they were actually part of. Creating and directing a scheme that results in multiple deaths, using people without their knowledge or consent, is conspiracy at its most serious level. Then you add the charges related to the bodies, criminal abuse of a corpse, illegal disposal of human remains, transportation of human remains without authorization. These charges exist because society has decided, through law, that the bodies of people who have died deserve a basic level of respect and protection. Cartman violated every single one of those protections deliberately and for his own entertainment. And then, at the top of the pile, you add the charge of knowingly serving human remains to another person. This is one of the hardest charges to find precedent for simply because it is so rare. Most legal systems have never had to prosecute something quite this specific. But the laws that would apply, food safety laws, assault by poison or contamination, criminal deception causing physical and psychological harm, all point in the same direction. What Cartman did to Scott Tenerman at that chili booth was not just cruel, it was a crime with a victim who had no way to protect himself, no warning, and no ability to consent or refuse. A lawyer would also note something that gets overlooked when people discuss this episode. Cartman was 10 years old, he was in 4th grade. And the level of planning, patience, and calculated cruelty he demonstrated is something that forensic psychologists and criminal lawyers rarely see in adults, let alone children. The question of how the juvenile justice system would handle a case this severe, and whether a 10-year-old could be tried as an adult given the nature and scale of what he did, is one that has no clean answer. But the legal system would be forced to ask it, because what happened to Jack and Linda Tenerman was not a child making a bad decision. It was a child executing a plan. Scott Tenerman never fully recovered from what Cartman did to him. In later appearances in the series, he is visibly broken. The damage was permanent, and Cartman, by the end of the episode, feels nothing but satisfaction. He got his revenge, he won. And somewhere in South Park, a farmer who had no idea he was being used went back inside after shooting 2 trespassers, and the only person who knew the full picture was a 10-year-old boy licking tears off someone's face. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Scott Tenerman case is the foundation of everything a lawyer would need to argue about Eric Cartman. It sets the standard for how he operates. Patient, calculated, thorough, and completely indifferent to the harm he causes. Every other case we are going to look at shares that same DNA. But what is interesting is that not all of Cartman's crimes involve death. Some of them involve something that sounds far less serious on the surface: confinement, deception, and a story about the end of the world. And those cases raise an entirely different set of legal questions that are just as troubling in their own way. Section 2, False Imprisonment. The Butters Stotch Bomb Shelter Incident, S7E11, Casa Bonita. There is a version of Eric Cartman that people sometimes find funny, the loud one. The one throwing tantrums in the grocery store, screaming on the floor, kicking and crying until he gets what he wants. That version of Cartman is easy to laugh at because it is ridiculous and over the top and ultimately harmless. But there is another version of Cartman that is a lot harder to laugh at, the quiet one. The one who does not scream and does not throw a fit, but instead sits down, thinks about what he wants, and then figures out the most efficient way to get it regardless of what it costs someone else. That version of Cartman showed up in full during the Casa Bonita incident, and a lawyer looking at what happened would not find it funny at all. Casa Bonita is a real restaurant in Denver, Colorado. If you have never been there or heard of it, it is the kind of place that is less about the food and more about the experience. There are cliff divers and a cave and a waterfall and entertainers walking around, and the whole thing is built to feel like an adventure rather than a meal. For kids growing up in South Park, it is basically the greatest place on earth. And for Cartman specifically, Casa Bonita was something close to a lifelong dream. He wanted to go more than almost anything. So when Kyle announced that he was having his birthday party at Casa Bonita, Cartman was immediately desperate to be included. The problem was that Kyle did not invite him. Kyle invited Stan, he invited Kenny, and he invited Butters, not Cartman. Kyle and Cartman had a difficult relationship built on years of Cartman saying and doing genuinely horrible things to Kyle specifically, and Kyle had simply decided that his birthday party was not going to include someone who had made his life miserable on a regular basis. This was a completely reasonable decision. Cartman obviously did not see it that way. For most people, not being invited to a birthday party is disappointing. You feel left out. Maybe you are upset for a little while. And then you move on, because that is what people do when they face small disappointments in life. Cartman did not move on. Instead, he began constructing a plan. And the plan he came up with is the kind of thing that sounds absurd when you describe it out loud, but becomes genuinely alarming the moment you start looking at it carefully. Cartman went to Butters. Butters Stotch was, at this point in the series, already established as the most trusting and naive kid in South Park. He believed almost everything he was told. He wanted to please people. He did not like conflict. He was, in other words, the perfect person for Cartman to target if you needed someone to go along with something without asking too many questions. Cartman told Butters that a massive meteor was headed directly toward Earth. He told him that the impact was coming very soon. He told him that civilization as they knew it was about to end, and that the only way to survive was to get into a shelter immediately and stay there until it was safe to come out. Butters believed him. This is the part a lawyer would focus on first, because it is where the crime actually begins. Cartman did not physically grab Butters and lock him in a room. He did not use a chain or a door with a lock on it. What he used was a lie, a deliberate, detailed, carefully constructed lie designed specifically to make Butters believe that the outside world was dangerous, and that staying hidden was the only way to survive. And under the law, it does not matter how you confine someone. It does not matter whether you use a physical barrier or a false belief. If you intentionally restrict another person's freedom of movement through force, threat, or deception, and that person stays where they are because of what you did, then you have committed false imprisonment. The method does not change the crime. Cartman used a story about a meteor, the same way someone else might use a locked door. The result was the same. Butters stayed. Cartman set up a small shelter situation in his backyard. Butters climbed in and began waiting for the end of the world that Cartman had told him was coming. He had limited supplies. He had no way to communicate with anyone outside. He had no real information about what was happening because the only information he had ever received about the situation came from Cartman, who had made the whole thing up. And while Butters sat in that confined space, genuinely believing that a catastrophic event had either already happened or was about to happen, Cartman got himself invited to Casa Bonita by filling the spot that Butters could no longer use because Butters was, as far as anyone knew, missing. Let that sit for a moment. Cartman did not just confine Butters to get him out of the way. He then used Butters' absence as the mechanism to get himself into the birthday party. Butters being trapped was not a side effect of Cartman's plan. It was the plan. The entire scheme had two goals that worked together. Keep Butters hidden so that he could not attend the party, and then step into that empty spot so that Cartman could go instead. Butters' suffering and confinement were the foundation on which Cartman built his trip to Casa Bonita. That is not an accident or a coincidence. That is the deliberate use of another person as a tool, and it is exactly the kind of intentional conduct that makes a false imprisonment case very strong in a courtroom. Butters stayed hidden for days. During that time, he was surviving on whatever limited supplies had been left for him, with no real understanding of how long he needed to stay, no ability to go outside or get help, and a growing fear about what the world outside looked like now that the meteor had apparently hit. He was a child, alone, confined, and genuinely terrified, and not because anything dangerous had actually happened, but because someone had deliberately put that fear inside his head to keep him exactly where Cartman needed him to be. Eventually, Butters came out of hiding. When he did, he looked around South Park, and because he had been told the world had ended, began interpreting everything he saw through that lens. He wandered through the town believing he was in a post-apocalyptic world, that the people he saw were possibly dangerous survivors, and that the normal rules of life no longer applied. He got into several situations during this period that caused disruption and confusion for the people around him, none of whom understood why this child was behaving as though civilization had collapsed. Butters was not making strange choices because he was strange. He was making those choices because Cartman had spent days building a false reality inside his head, and Butters had no reason to doubt any of it. A lawyer building the case against Cartman for this incident would stack the charges in a very specific order. The first and most central charge is false imprisonment. The definition is straightforward. You cannot intentionally restrict another person's freedom of movement without their consent and without legal justification. Cartman did exactly that. Butters did not choose to stay in that shelter freely. He stayed because he had been told that leaving would mean dying in a post-meteor wasteland. His consent was not real because it was based entirely on a lie that Cartman had constructed. Real consent requires real information. What Butters gave was not consent. It was compliance based on fear, and fear that Cartman had manufactured deliberately. The second charge is child endangerment. Butters was a minor. He was placed in a confined space with limited supplies, no adult supervision, no ability to call for help, and no accurate understanding of his situation. The conditions he was kept in were not safe. The psychological impact of believing the world had ended while sitting alone in a small shelter. That is not a neutral experience for a child. That is a harmful one. Cartman created those conditions on purpose, and he left Butters in them for multiple days without checking to make sure he was physically or mentally okay. A responsible adult who discovered a child in those conditions would be legally obligated to report it. Cartman was the one who created those conditions, which makes the legal exposure significantly worse. The third charge is criminal fraud, or criminal deception. This one is interesting because it goes slightly beyond the false imprisonment itself. Cartman did not just lie to Butters. He constructed a detailed false scenario over time, maintained it actively, and used it to produce a specific outcome, Butters' confinement, that benefited Cartman directly. That kind of sustained, deliberate deception used to produce real harm to a real person is not just dishonesty. It is fraud in the legal sense because Cartman used false information to take something of value from Butters, namely his freedom, his safety, and multiple days of his life. What makes this case particularly interesting from a legal standpoint is how ordinary the motive was. Cartman did not do this because he hated Butters. He did not do it out of deep resentment the way he did with Scott Tenerman. He did it because he wanted to go to a restaurant with cliff divers and a waterfall. He destroyed multiple days of another child's life, caused him genuine psychological distress, put him in a physically uncomfortable and potentially dangerous situation, and sent him wandering through town in a state of confused terror, all because he wanted the birthday party experience. The smallness of the motive does not make the crime smaller. If anything, a lawyer would argue it makes it worse. It shows that Cartman does not need a major reason to do major harm to someone. He just needs a reason, any reason at all. At the end of the episode, Cartman is found at Casa Bonita and taken away. He had gotten what he wanted. He had gone to the restaurant, he had seen the cliff divers, and walked through the cave and experienced everything he had dreamed about. And Butters had paid for every minute of it with days of fear and confinement and confusion. When Cartman is taken away, he does not express guilt. He does not apologize. He says it was worth it. He experienced Casa Bonita, and no amount of consequences changes that for him. The experience happened. That is what mattered to him. A lawyer hearing that statement would write it down carefully. Because a defendant who looks at the harm they caused and says it was worth it is a defendant who is telling you exactly who they are. They are telling you that the harm to the other person was a price they were willing to pay, that they calculated it and accepted it and would make the same choice again. That is not remorse. That is not an accident. That is a person explaining their value system clearly and directly, and in that value system, what Butters went through was an acceptable cost for a good night out. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Butters shelter case sits at an interesting point in Cartman's legal history because it shows something the Scott Tenerman case also showed, but in a lower stakes situation. Cartman's planning ability is not reserved for moments of extreme anger or deep personal hatred. It shows up whenever he wants something badly enough. The scale changes depending on how much he wants it. And that consistency is what a lawyer would keep coming back to, because a pattern of behavior is one of the most powerful things you can present in a courtroom. One incident can be explained. Two incidents start to look like a habit. And as we are about to see, when Cartman's target was someone he genuinely resented rather than just someone standing in the way of a birthday party, the harm he was willing to cause reached a level that moves well beyond confinement and into territory that carries some of the most serious criminal consequences the law has to offer. Section 3, Deliberate Infection, the HIV injection, S12E1, tonsil trouble. There is a question that comes up sometimes when people talk about Eric Cartman and the things he has done. The question is whether he is simply a child who acts without thinking, or whether he is something more calculated than that. The Scott Tenerman case answered that question for a lot of people. The Casa Bonita incident confirmed it. But if you still had any doubt, and if you were still holding on to the idea that maybe Cartman is just a kid who goes too far sometimes without fully understanding what he is doing, then the events of the tonsil trouble episode would remove that doubt. Completely and permanently. Because what Cartman did to Kyle in this episode is not something you do by accident. It is not something you do in the heat of the moment. It is something you plan. It is something you carry out in the dark, in secret, while your target is asleep and completely unaware. And a lawyer looking at it would recognize it immediately for what it is. One of the most serious things one person can deliberately do to another. The episode begins with something that has nothing to do with Kyle at all. Cartman is going to the hospital to have his tonsils removed. This is a routine procedure. Millions of people have it done every year. You go in, you go under, they remove the tonsils, you wake up and eat ice cream for a few days, and then you are fine. That is how it was supposed to go for Cartman. That is not how it went. Due to a medical error during the procedure, Cartman was accidentally given a blood transfusion that was contaminated. When the results came back, the diagnosis was confirmed. Cartman had contracted HIV. Now, to be clear about what HIV is without using medical language that goes over anyone's head, it is a serious virus that affects the body's ability to fight off illness. In the real world, it is managed with medication, and people with HIV can live long, full lives with proper treatment. But in the world of South Park, and certainly in the world of 2008 when this episode aired, an HIV diagnosis carried enormous weight. It was not just a health issue. It was something that came with stigma and fear and a lifetime of difficult conversations. For a 4th grader in South Park, finding out you have HIV is not a small thing. It is a life-changing piece of news. Cartman told his friends. He was not quiet about it. He went to school, he told the boys, and the reaction he got from most of them was somewhere between shocked and sympathetic. But Kyle's reaction was different. Kyle laughed. He laughed hard. He found it genuinely funny that Cartman, of all people, had contracted HIV, and he did not try very hard to hide that. From Kyle's perspective, this was probably an understandable response given the years of cruelty and abuse he had received from Cartman. There was likely some part of Kyle that felt like this was the universe finally delivering a consequence to someone who had spent years causing harm to everyone around him. Kyle laughed, and in that moment, he had no idea what that laughter was going to cost him. Cartman did not yell at Kyle. He did not immediately retaliate. He went quiet in the way that, if you have been paying attention to the pattern of how Cartman operates, should feel very familiar by now. He processed what had happened. He felt the humiliation of being laughed at by the person he resented most. And then he made a decision. The decision was not made in anger in the moment. It was made coldly, deliberately, and with full knowledge of what the outcome would be. Cartman decided that Kyle was going to have HIV too. What Cartman did next is where the legal case truly begins. He collected a sample of his own infected blood. He put it in a syringe. And in the middle of the night, while Kyle was asleep in his own bed in his own home, Cartman entered his room and injected Kyle with the infected blood. Kyle had no idea it was happening. He was asleep. He could not consent, could not refuse, could not protect himself. He woke up the next morning with no memory of anything unusual happening. And then, not long after, Kyle tested positive for HIV. A lawyer reading through the facts of this case would stop at this point and take a very long pause. Because what just happened, now the act of deliberately collecting infected blood, entering someone's home without permission, and injecting that person with a disease-causing substance while they sleep, is not a gray area. There is no version of this where the law looks at it from multiple angles and reaches a complicated conclusion. This is a clear and direct criminal act. Multiple criminal acts, in fact, stacked on top of each other, each one serious enough on its own to result in significant criminal consequences. The first charge a lawyer would identify is breaking and entering, or unlawful entry. Cartman entered Kyle's home without permission in the middle of the night. While Kyle and his family were asleep, he was not invited. He was not there for any legitimate reason. He entered that home specifically to commit a harmful act against someone inside it. Entering another person's home without their knowledge or consent is a crime on its own before anything else that happened that night is even factored in. The second charge is assault. In simple terms, assault in a legal sense means intentionally doing something harmful or offensive to another person's body without their consent. Cartman took a needle and put it into Kyle's body while Kyle was unconscious and unable to agree to it. That is assault. There is no other word for it. The fact that Kyle did not wake up during it does not change what happened to his body. The fact that Cartman was also a child does not change what he did, but the third charge is where this case reaches a level of seriousness that puts it in a completely different category from most of what we will discuss in this entire essay. In most places in the United States, deliberately infecting another person with a serious communicable disease on purpose, with knowledge of what you are doing, is a crime. In many states, it is a felony. In some places, depending on the circumstances and the intent involved, it can be charged as attempted murder. Because what Cartman did was not pass a virus accidentally. He did not sneeze on Kyle. He did not fail to mention that he was sick. He specifically collected the material needed to infect Kyle, stored it, transported it to Kyle's home, and delivered it directly into Kyle's bloodstream. That is not carelessness. That is not an accident. That requires planning. It requires equipment. It requires physical action taken in secret against a person who is completely vulnerable. A lawyer arguing this case in front of a jury would spend a great deal of time on the word deliberately. Because the difference between accidentally exposing someone to a disease and deliberately infecting them is one of the most important legal distinctions you can make. Accidental exposure might lead to civil consequences, meaning someone suing for damages. Deliberate infection is a crime, and the evidence for deliberateness here is overwhelming. Cartman did not stumble into Kyle's room by accident with a syringe in his hand. He went there on purpose, with a specific goal, having prepared in advance. The intent is written into every step of what he did. There is also a charge worth examining that sits slightly outside the core criminal case, but matters enormously from a legal standpoint. Cartman entered Kyle's home. Kyle's parents were in that house. Kyle's little brother, Ike, was in that house. The act of entering a family's home in the middle of the night while everyone is sleeping, for any reason, creates a level of threat and danger that goes beyond just the person being targeted. A lawyer would look at the safety implications of what Cartman did for the entire Broflovski household that night, and those implications would factor into how seriously the situation was treated by any court. What makes this particular case even more striking when you examine it closely is that Cartman's motive was not survival. It was not protection. It was not even deep personal hatred in the way the Scott Tenerman case was driven by deep personal hatred. Cartman infected Kyle with HIV because Kyle laughed at him. That is the full extent of the reason. Kyle found something funny and laughed, and Cartman's response was to break into his house and inject him with a virus. The gap between the cause and the response is enormous, and a lawyer presenting this to a jury would make sure that gap was fully understood. Because the size of the response relative to the cause says something very important about the person who carried it out. It says that no slight is small enough to be let go. It says that any moment of humiliation, no matter how minor, is enough to justify harm. And it says that the harm Cartman is willing to cause has no ceiling connected to how serious the original offense was. Kyle, once he found out what had happened, was understandably devastated. He had HIV. He was a child. He had done nothing more than laugh at some news, and now he had a serious virus in his body because of it. The two of them eventually ended up working together to find a solution, which they did. The resolution of the episode involves them discovering that Magic Johnson had unknowingly been treating his own HIV for years through close contact with large amounts of old money that had trace amounts of a substance on it, and that this substance was the actual reason he had remained healthy for so long. They used this discovery to find a treatment that cured both of them, but the cure does not erase the crime. The fact that the story ended with a resolution does not mean that what Cartman did on the way to that resolution was acceptable or legal. If someone shoots you and a surgeon later saves your life, the person who shot you still shot you. The outcome changes your physical condition. It does not change what was done. A lawyer would be careful to make this point clearly and repeatedly. The existence of a cure in the story is not a legal defense. The fact that Kyle recovered does not reduce what Cartman did to him while he was asleep and vulnerable in his own bedroom. In criminal law, you are judged for your actions and your intent at the moment you acted, not for what happened afterward. Cartman collected infected blood, entered someone's home without permission, and injected that person with a disease-causing substance while they slept. Those facts do not change based on how the story ended. The tonsil trouble case is also important because of where it falls in the timeline of Cartman's behavior. By this point in the series, a lawyer would be building a picture of a person whose response to any form of personal humiliation or disappointment is immediate, calculated harm to whoever caused it. Scott Tenerman laughed at him and two people ended up dead. Kyle laughed at him and Kyle ended up with HIV. The pattern is not subtle. The escalation from one incident to the next is not random. It is a consistent, repeating cycle of perceived humiliation followed by deliberate and disproportionate retaliation, and in a legal context, that pattern matters enormously because a pattern tells you what someone is likely to do next. It tells you that past behavior is a reliable guide to future behavior, and it tells any jury paying attention that what they are looking at is not a series of isolated mistakes. It is a way of operating. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The tonsil trouble case would be devastating in a courtroom, not just because of what Cartman did, but because of how easily and completely he did it. He did not struggle with the decision. He did not hesitate. He identified what he wanted, figured out how to get it, and carried it out quietly while the person he was targeting slept. And that same quietness, that same ease and confidence in causing harm is exactly what makes the next chapter of Cartman's legal record so deeply unsettling, because the next case involves something that happened while another person was sleeping. But the nature of what Cartman did in that darkness carries a completely different and even heavier weight under the law. Section 4. Sexual assault of a minor and production of child pornography. The Butters photograph. S11E2. Cartman sucks. There are moments in Eric Cartman's history that are played for laughs in the show. There are moments that are clearly meant to be outrageous and over the top in the way that South Park often is. And then there are moments that, when you strip away the animation and the comedy framing and look at what actually happened in plain terms, land somewhere very different. They land in a place that is not funny and was never really funny, where the thing being described is serious enough that the only honest way to examine it is carefully and directly. The events of the episode Cartman Sucks fall into that last category, and a lawyer looking at what Cartman did in this episode would not spend any time trying to find the humor in it. They would spend their time building one of the heaviest cases in this entire essay. To understand what happened, you first need to understand a habit that Cartman had developed before this specific episode. Cartman had a pattern of inviting boys over for sleepovers, and then, while they were asleep, doing embarrassing things and photographing them. This was something he did for his own amusement and to have material he could use against people later. The things he did in these photos were designed to embarrass whoever was in them and make them look bad in front of other people. He treated sleeping, unaware children as props for his own entertainment. This was already a pattern of behavior before the Butters incident. It was already a habit. That context matters because it shows that what happened with Butters was not an isolated moment of poor judgment. It was part of a repeated, established practice. In the episode, Cartman had Butters over. Butters fell asleep. And while Butters was completely unconscious and unaware of anything happening around him, Cartman took a photograph of himself with Butters' private parts in his mouth. His stated intention was to take this photograph to school and show it around to make Butters look bad in front of everyone. In Cartman's mind, this was a humiliation tactic. He was going to use the image to embarrass Butters socially, to damage how other kids saw him, and to give himself a position of power over Butters by having something that could be used against him at any time. He showed the photograph to Stan first, which was his first step toward taking it to a wider audience at school. Stan's reaction was not what Cartman expected. Stan looked at the photograph and told Cartman that the photo did not make Butters look bad at all. It made Cartman look bad because Cartman was the one who had done the thing in the photo while Butters was asleep and had no idea it was happening. Butters was just unconscious. Cartman was the one who had made the active choice. Stan pointed this out clearly, and Cartman suddenly panicked, realized that he had created something that could be turned against him rather than against Butters. What followed from there involved Cartman trying to get the photograph back and deal with the situation he had created for himself. But a lawyer sitting across from Cartman would not be focused on what happened after Cartman realized his plan had backfired. A lawyer would be focused entirely on what Cartman did while Butters was asleep, because that is where the crime is. That is where multiple serious crimes are, stacked directly on top of each other, each one significant enough on its own to result in consequences that would follow a person for the rest of their life. The first thing a lawyer would identify is the act itself. Butters was asleep. He was unconscious. He had no idea what was happening to his body. He did not agree to anything. He did not have the ability to agree to anything because he was not awake. What Cartman did to Butters' body while Butters was in that state is, by any legal definition that exists in any American state or in most places around the world, sexual assault. It does not matter that Butters did not know it happened at the time. It does not matter that there was no physical injury. What matters is that a sexual act was performed on a person's body without their knowledge and without their consent, and that the person it was performed on was a child. Every single one of those facts points in the same legal direction, and that direction is one of the most serious classifications of crime that exists. The second thing a lawyer would identify is the photograph. Cartman did not just do what he did in the dark and leave no record of it. He specifically created a record of it. He took a photo, he produced an image that depicted a sexual act involving a child's body. The moment that photograph was created, Cartman had produced what the law classifies as child sexual abuse material. This is one of the most strictly prosecuted categories of crime in the entire legal system. The laws around this type of material are not ambiguous. They are not complicated. They are very direct. Creating an image that depicts sexual content involving a minor is a serious crime. It does not matter what the creator intended to do with it. It does not matter whether Cartman wanted to use it to embarrass Butters or to entertain himself or for any other purpose. The act of creating the image is the crime. The image existing is the crime. Everything that comes after the moment the photo was taken is additional criminal exposure layered on top of an already serious base charge. The third thing a lawyer would look at is what Cartman planned to do with the photograph. He did not create it and keep it private. He did not take it and immediately feel bad about it and destroy it. He took it to Stan. He was in the process of showing it around before Stan's reaction stopped him. His stated plan was to show it to the other kids at school, to pass it around, to distribute it to as many people as possible in order to maximize the damage to Butters' reputation. In legal terms, distributing material of this kind, or passing it from one person to another, showing it to multiple people, is a separate and additional crime on top of creating it. The distribution charge and the production charge are two different things, and Cartman was in the active process of committing both of them before he was accidentally stopped by Stan pointing out that the photo hurt Cartman more than it hurt Butters. A lawyer would also look at the possession charge. Once the photograph was created, it existed somewhere. It was on a camera or in a format that could be held and viewed. Cartman had it. He was in possession of it. Possessing this type of material involving a minor is itself a crime, separate from creating it and separate from distributing it. So at the point where Cartman had taken the photo and not yet shown it to anyone, he was already facing a production charge and a possession charge. When he showed it to Stan, the distribution charge began. 3 serious criminal charges, all arising from a single event, all related to the same photograph. Now the question of age becomes relevant here, because Cartman is a child. He is in 4th grade. He is roughly 9 or 10 years old. And whenever we talk about a crime committed by someone that young, the legal system has to ask different questions than it would ask about an adult. The juvenile justice system exists specifically to handle situations where the person who caused harm is also a minor. But the fact that Cartman is a minor does not make what he did disappear from a legal perspective. It changes how the system responds to it. It does not change what happened or how serious it is. In cases involving this type of harm to a child, many legal systems have mandatory reporting laws. This means that if certain adults, teachers, doctors, counselors, coaches, become aware that something like this has happened, they are required by law to report it to the appropriate authorities. They do not have the option to decide it is not serious enough or to handle it quietly. They are legally obligated to report it. If any adult in South Park had known what Cartman had done and failed to report it, they could have faced their own legal consequences for staying silent. The nature of the crime is serious enough that the law does not leave the reporting decision up to individual judgment. A lawyer would also spend time examining Butters' situation specifically. Butters did not know what had happened to him during this episode. He was asleep when it occurred. He went about his life without being aware that a photograph of this kind existed, that his body had been used in this way, or that there was an image being passed around that depicted him. The harm to Butters in this case is not only the act itself. It is the existence of the image. It is the fact that Cartman had shown it to at least one person before being stopped. It is the fact that Butters' body was used as a prop in someone else's scheme without Butters having any ability to stop it or even know about it. A lawyer representing Butters in any civil case connected to these events would have an enormous amount to work with. The broader pattern also matters here. Remember that this was not the first time Cartman had done something like this. He had a habit of photographing sleeping boys in embarrassing situations. This episode was the point where that habit crossed from uncomfortable and invasive into territory with serious criminal implications. But the existence of the habit before this point tells you something important. It tells you that Cartman had developed a practice of treating unconscious, unaware children as objects he could use however he wanted for his own purposes. He had done it enough times that it was routine for him. It was a normal part of how he spent time at sleepovers. That level of comfort with that kind of behavior, that absence of hesitation or guilt or awareness that something was wrong, is something a lawyer would highlight as significant context. In a courtroom, context matters. Individual acts matter, but so does the pattern surrounding them. A lawyer presenting this case would not just present the single incident from this episode, they would present the habit. They would show that Cartman had done similar things before, that he had a practice of photographing sleeping children without consent, and that this episode was the natural extension of that practice taken to its most serious point. That pattern would be used to demonstrate that what happened was not a one-time lapse in judgment. It was the logical result of a repeated behavior that had been building for some time. The Cartman Sucks case sits apart from everything else in this essay because of the specific nature of the harm involved. The Scott Tenerman case was murder. The Casa Bonita case was false imprisonment. The tonsil trouble case was deliberate infection. All of those are severe. All of them carry heavy legal consequences. But the crimes involved in this episode, the ones related to what was done to Butters' body and the creation of that photograph, carry a specific weight in the legal system that is separate from almost everything else. The laws around protecting children from this type of harm are among the most serious on the books anywhere. They exist because society has made a firm decision that children deserve a specific and powerful level of protection from being used, exploited, or harmed in this way, and Cartman violated those protections completely. At the end of the episode, the photograph situation was resolved in a way that was convenient for the story, but again, as with the HIV case, the resolution of the story does not erase the crime. The photograph was created, the act occurred. Butters was harmed without ever knowing it had happened. A child's body was used without consent and then documented and partially distributed. Those facts existed in the episode regardless of how the narrative wrapped up, and a lawyer would not let the comfortable ending of the story do the work of pretending the beginning of it never happened. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What makes the cumulative picture of Cartman so striking at this point in the essay is how many different categories of serious crime he has managed to reach: murder, false imprisonment, deliberate infection with a disease, and now crimes related to the exploitation of a child's body. Each case stands entirely on its own. Each one would be a career-defining prosecution for any lawyer who handled it. And yet all of them belong to the same person, the same fourth grader from South Park, Colorado. The same boy who throws tantrums about his mom not buying him things, who argues with his friends about video games, and who also, in the quiet moments when no one is paying attention, causes harm on a scale that most adults never come close to. And as alarming as what we have covered so far has been, Cartman was also perfectly capable of taking his talent for deception into public settings, in front of cameras and crowds, in ways that managed to be fraudulent, manipulative, and deeply offensive to entire groups of people all at the same time. Section 5. Fraud through medical impersonation, Tourette's syndrome in the Special Olympics, S11E8, Le Petit Tourette, /S8E2, up the down steroid. By the time you have worked through the first 4 cases in Cartman's legal history, a picture starts to form. The picture is of someone who causes harm primarily in private, in bedrooms, in backyards, in the dark. Someone whose most serious crimes happen when no one else is watching, when the target is asleep or alone or unaware. But Cartman was not only capable of causing harm in private, he was also perfectly comfortable walking into public spaces, in front of cameras and crowds and institutions, and committing fraud on a scale that pulled in television networks, non-profit organizations, and entire communities of real people who had done nothing wrong. The 2 cases in this section are different from what came before in one important way. Cartman did not hide, he performed. And a lawyer examining both of these cases would find that performing a lie in public, in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, and in front of vulnerable people who deserve protection is not a lesser crime than the ones committed in the dark. In some ways, it is a more complicated one. The first case comes from the episode Le Petit Tourette, and it begins the way many of Cartman's schemes begin, with him noticing something and immediately asking himself how he can use it. Cartman encountered a boy named Thomas who had Tourette's syndrome. Tourette's syndrome is a real neurological condition where a person experiences involuntary movements and sounds, including in some cases the involuntary saying of words or phrases they have no control over. For the small percentage of people with Tourette's who experience this specific symptom, it is not something they choose. It is not something they enjoy. It causes real distress, social difficulty, and a lifetime of having to explain something deeply personal to people who do not understand it. It is a condition that affects real people in real ways, and the community of people who live with it deserves to have it understood accurately and treated with seriousness. Cartman watched Thomas and saw none of that. What Cartman saw was a loophole. He saw someone who was permitted to say offensive things in public spaces because those words came out involuntarily as part of a medical condition, and he saw that the people around Thomas responded with patience and understanding rather than anger or punishment. And in that observation, Cartman found exactly what he was always looking for, a way to do something harmful without facing any consequences for it. He decided to fake Tourette's syndrome. He began practicing at home, rehearsing the symptoms in front of a mirror, getting comfortable with the performance so that it would look convincing in public. He was deliberate about it. He studied what he had seen from Thomas and built his own version of it carefully. Then he began using the fake condition in public settings, using the cover of the supposed medical condition to say deeply offensive, racist, and harmful things to people around him while presenting it as something he could not control. Every time someone reacted with discomfort or anger, he leaned on the performance to deflect the reaction. The condition was his shield. The condition was fake. A lawyer looking at this behavior would identify several serious issues. The first is straightforward fraud. Cartman was claiming to have a medical condition he did not have in order to obtain something of value. In this case, the social permission to say harmful things without facing consequences. Misrepresenting your medical status to gain benefits, protections, or permissions that you would not otherwise have is fraud. It does not have to involve money to be fraud. It just has to involve using a false claim to get something you are not entitled to. The second issue is the harm caused to the broader community of people who actually have Tourette's syndrome. When Cartman used his fake condition to say offensive and racist things in public, he was attaching those words and that behavior to a medical condition that real people live with every day. Every time someone with a genuine condition is already fighting for understanding and respect and to have their condition taken seriously, someone faking that condition and using it as cover for deliberate offensiveness makes that fight harder. A lawyer in a civil context might explore whether that kind of deliberate misrepresentation carried out publicly and causing measurable harm to the reputation of a medical condition could support any kind of legal action beyond straightforward fraud. The third issue is the television program. Cartman's fake condition got him booked as a guest on a television news interview. He sat in front of cameras and an audience and a production team and presented himself as a child with a legitimate medical condition. He spoke to the program's host. He performed his fake symptoms on camera. The entire interview was built on a false premise that Cartman had constructed deliberately. A lawyer would look at this and see fraud against the television network, obtaining airtime under false pretenses, and potentially defamation of the medical condition being misrepresented to a large viewing audience. The moment a lie gets broadcast on television, the reach of the harm expands dramatically. It is not just the people in the room who have been deceived, it is everyone watching. What is particularly interesting about the Le Petit Tourette case from a legal standpoint is that it has a strange resolution. As the episode progresses, Cartman finds that the constant performance of fake involuntary speech begins to blur with actual involuntary speech. He starts saying things he genuinely does not want to say. Honest admissions, embarrassing truths, things he has kept hidden, and he cannot stop them from coming out because he has trained himself so thoroughly in the performance of losing control. By the end of the episode, his plan is unraveling, not because he was caught in the fraud, but because the fraud was consuming him. He tries desperately to stop the television appearance from happening because he can no longer control what will come out of his mouth. He had built a machine to harm others, and the machine turned on him. A lawyer would note this detail without too much sympathy. The fact that Cartman's plan partially backfired does not reduce the fraudulent intent at the beginning of it. He faked a medical condition. He used that fake condition to broadcast offensive and harmful content in public. He deceived a television production. The outcome of the scheme for Cartman personally is separate from the legal question of what he did on the way to that outcome. The second case in this section is different in tone, but equally serious in legal terms, and it comes from the episode Up the Down Steroid. If the Tourette's case was about faking a neurological condition to gain social cover, this case was about faking a cognitive disability to gain a financial advantage in a protected competition, and the victims in this case were not abstract. They were specific real people within the show's world, athletes with genuine disabilities who had trained hard and deserved a fair competition. The Special Olympics is a real organization in the world, and it is represented in this episode as it actually functions. A competition designed specifically for athletes with intellectual disabilities, giving them a space to compete, be recognized, and be celebrated for their athletic achievements. The prize money in the episode was $1,000. Cartman wanted that money, and his plan to get it was to fake a cognitive disability convincingly enough to be allowed to enter the competition as a participant. Cartman spent time preparing for this. He practiced walking and moving in ways he thought would make him appear to have a disability. He rehearsed how he would present himself during registration and during the events themselves. He was deliberate about the performance in the same way he was deliberate about the Tourette's performance. He was not walking into this carelessly. He thought through what he needed to do to be convincing, and he put in the work to build the act. He registered for the Special Olympics under the false pretense of having a qualifying disability. He entered officially. He was accepted as a participant. And then he competed, or attempted to compete, against athletes who had genuine disabilities and who had been training seriously for this event. Here's where the episode delivers something genuinely significant, and a lawyer would appreciate the irony of it even while building a serious fraud case around it. Cartman lost. He lost badly. He did not win a single event. The athletes he competed against, the ones he had assumed would be easy to beat because of their disabilities, were in fact strong, capable, well-trained competitors who outperformed him in every category. Cartman came in last or near last in everything he entered. The assumptions he had built his entire scheme on, that people with disabilities would be slower and weaker and easier to beat, were completely wrong. The athletes were better than him. The plan failed entirely on its own terms, but the failure of the plan is not the legal story. The legal story is what Cartman did before the competition started. A lawyer would not care very much about the fact that Cartman lost. They would care about the fact that he entered. Because entering a protected competition under false pretenses, using a fabricated disability claim to gain access to a competition specifically designed for people with genuine disabilities, is fraud. It is fraud against the organization running the event. It is fraud against the other participants who were competing in good faith. It is fraud against the system that exists specifically to give certain people a fair and protected space to compete. The charges a lawyer would build in the Special Olympics case start with fraudulent misrepresentation. Cartman made a false claim about his medical and cognitive status to gain entry to an event. He obtained that entry through that false claim. The fact that he did not ultimately profit from it because he lost does not eliminate the fraud. Fraud is complete at the moment the false representation is made and acted upon. Cartman made the false claim. The organization accepted it and gave him entry. That transaction, built entirely on a lie, is where the crime sits. There is also the harm to the other participants to consider. Every spot in a competition like this is limited. By taking a spot under false pretenses, Cartman potentially kept someone with a genuine qualifying disability from participating. Beyond the practical issue of limited spots, there is the deeper issue of what it means to enter a protected space without the right to be there. The Special Olympics exists because people with disabilities deserve their own space where the competition is fair and designed for them. Cartman's presence in that space, built on fraud, was a violation of something more than just a rule. It was a violation of the purpose behind the entire event. When you place the Tourette's case and the Special Olympics case next to each other, what you see is a consistent pattern of Cartman targeting vulnerable communities and protected groups and using them as vehicles for his own gain. In the Tourette's case, he exploited a legitimate neurological condition and the goodwill that society extends to people who live with it. In the Special Olympics case, he exploited a protected competition and the goodwill society extends to athletes with disabilities. In both cases, the harm extended beyond the immediate fraud. It spread outward to the real communities, the real people living with Tourette's, the real athletes in programs like the Special Olympics, who found their space and their dignity and their protections treated as props in someone else's scheme. A lawyer handling both of these cases together would present them as evidence of a specific and recurring pattern. Cartman identifies something that exists to protect or support a vulnerable group of people, and he figures out how to exploit that. Protection for himself. He wears the armor that was built for someone else, and in doing so, he harms not just the system he defrauded, but everyone the system was built to protect. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. As extensive as this fraud case is, though, it shares one thing with all of the previous cases we have examined. Cartman was acting mostly for personal gain. Whether it was revenge, a restaurant visit, a medical retaliation, or prize money, there was always something Cartman specifically wanted on the other side of the harm. But there is a case coming that operates on an entirely different level, one where what Cartman built was not aimed at getting something for himself, but at organizing other people around hatred, and where the threat he created was not directed at a single person, but at a population. Section 6, Incitement to Hatred and Terroristic Threats. The Ginger Supremacy Movement, S9E11, Ginger Kids. Every case we have looked at so far in this essay has had a personal target: Scott Tenerman, Butters Stotch, Kyle Broflovsky. The television network, the Special Olympics organization. In every instance, Cartman identified a specific person or specific group he wanted something from, and he built his plan around that target. The harm radiated outward from a center point. It was personal, it was directed, it was, in a strange way, almost contained, in the sense that you could draw a line from Cartman's motive to his victim and understand the connection between them. But the case we are examining in this section does not work that way. This case does not have a single personal target. This case has a population, and the harm Cartman set in motion here was not aimed at one person or one organization. It was aimed at an entire category of human beings, defined purely by how they looked, and the method Cartman used to cause that harm was not a syringe in the dark or a lie told to a trusting child. It was a school presentation. It was a speech. It was organized leadership of a movement built entirely around hatred, and a lawyer examining this case would need to ask a question that goes beyond the individual charges. At what point does speech become a crime? The episode begins with Cartman delivering a presentation to his class at South Park Elementary. The presentation is about what Cartman calls ginger kids, children with red hair, light skin, and freckles. From the very opening of this presentation, Cartman is not exploring a topic or sharing information. He is building an argument. The argument is that ginger kids are different from other children in a fundamental way that makes them lesser. He claims that they carry a condition he calls gingivitis. He claims that because of this condition, ginger kids are to be feared, avoided, and treated as inferior to everyone else. And the centerpiece of his argument, the claim he returns to and emphasizes throughout the presentation, is that ginger kids have no souls. It is worth pausing on that claim specifically because a lawyer would. Saying that a group of people defined by their physical appearance has no soul is not a statement about facts. It is not an opinion about behavior or choices. It is a declaration that an entire category of human beings is fundamentally not fully human. It is the kind of statement that, throughout history, has been used to justify the mistreatment of groups of people by first removing their humanity in the minds of the people around them. You do not have to reach very far into history to find examples of populations being harmed after campaigns that started with exactly this kind of language. The idea that this group, defined by how they look, is different in a way that puts them outside the circle of people who deserve full protection and respect. A lawyer would recognize that framing immediately, and they would take it seriously. The impact of Cartman's presentation on the school was immediate and real. After he finished, the atmosphere at South Park Elementary shifted. Ginger kids at the school began to be treated differently by other students. They were avoided. They were talked about in ways that echoed the language Cartman had used in his presentation. The discrimination that followed was a direct result of what Cartman had said. He had stood in front of his peers in an official school setting and delivered a systematic argument for why one group of students deserved to be treated as less than everyone else. And his peers, many of them young enough and impressionable enough to absorb what they heard without questioning it fully, responded by treating ginger kids exactly the way Cartman had suggested they should be treated. A lawyer would identify this as incitement. Incitement, in its simplest form, is when someone says or does something that directly causes other people to treat a group harmfully. The speech itself does not have to be the harm. The harm that follows the speech is the evidence that the speech crossed the line from opinion into something with real damaging consequences. Cartman stood up in front of an audience of children and told them that a specific group among them was soulless and inferior. Children at the school then began treating that group as inferior. With a line between what Cartman said and what happened afterward is not indirect or complicated. It is a straight line. He spoke. They acted on what he said. People were harmed. The boys in Cartman's friend group were aware of what had happened and decided to respond to it in a way that, while not exactly a legal remedy, produced significant consequences of its own. While Cartman was asleep, they dyed his hair red and applied freckles to his face to make him appear as though he was a ginger kid. When Cartman woke up and looked in the mirror, he believed that he had somehow become ginger overnight. He was horrified. Every terrible thing he had said about ginger kids in his presentation was now, in his mind, being applied to himself. He was suddenly on the receiving end of his own argument. And here is where the episode takes a turn that is significant both for the story and for the legal case. Cartman did not respond to this by questioning whether his original presentation had been wrong. He did not feel what it was like to be on the other side and develop any understanding or empathy. Instead, he made a decision that was in many ways entirely consistent with everything we have seen from him before. He adapted. He looked at his new situation, assessed it, and decided that the most effective response was not to reject the hatred he had created, but to take control of it, to lead it from a new position. Cartman organized the ginger kids. He reached out to them, he gathered them together, he positioned himself as their leader, and he began building a movement. He gave speeches. He told the ginger kids that they were not inferior, that they were actually superior, that they were the ones who deserved to rule, that the non-gingers were the real problem, the real threat, the real enemy. And then he took that argument to its most extreme conclusion. Cartman began calling for the killing of all non-gingers. He organized a group of children around the goal of eliminating an entire population defined by physical characteristics, and he did it with the same confidence and authority and organizational skill he had used to build his original anti-ginger argument. A lawyer sitting with this part of the case would need to work through several serious charges in order. The first is the original incitement from the school presentation. That presentation caused real harm to real students. It changed the social environment of the school in ways that were directly traceable to what Cartman said. Even if every other charge in this section disappeared, the incitement charge from the initial presentation would stand on its own as a serious matter. The second charge involves the movement itself. When Cartman began organizing ginger kids into a group, giving speeches, and directing that group toward a stated goal, he crossed from individual speech into organized activity. There is a legal difference between one person saying something harmful and one person building an organization around something harmful. An organization has leadership, structure, membership, and goals. Cartman provided all of those things. He was the leader, he set the direction, he recruited members, he stated the goals clearly and repeatedly. A lawyer would look at that organization and identify it as something the law treats with particular seriousness. A group organized around hatred of a population defined by physical characteristics, with a stated intent to cause harm to that population. The third and most serious charge is the terroristic threats. Cartman did not just suggest that non-gingers were bad people, he called for their killing. He stood in front of a group of children he had organized and recruited and led, and he told them that non-gingers needed to be eliminated. He made these statements not once, not in passing, but repeatedly as part of organized speeches delivered to an audience he was building toward action. In legal terms, making a credible threat to cause serious harm or death to a group of people is a terroristic threat. The threat does not have to be carried out for the charge to exist. The statement of intent made to an organized group being prepared for action is itself the crime. What makes this charge particularly strong in Cartman's case is the organization behind the threats. A single person making inflammatory statements in a public space is treated one way by the law. A person who has built a group, given that group leadership and direction, stated a clear goal of harm against a defined population, and is actively working to grow that group and move it toward action, that is treated very differently. That begins to look less like protected speech and more like the early stages of something that legal systems around the world have specific laws to address. Laws about organizing groups around hatred. Laws about directing organizations toward the targeting of populations. Laws about using leadership and persuasion to move people toward violence. A lawyer would also look at the age of the people Cartman recruited and led. He was a child himself, but so were the ginger kids he organized into his movement. He was taking children, some of whom were likely younger or more impressionable than he was, and building their identity around the idea that another group of people needed to be eliminated. He was giving them an enemy. He was giving them a cause built on hatred, and he was positioning himself as the authority figure directing all of it. The use of children as the membership of a hate movement, and the direction of those children toward violent rhetoric, adds an additional layer to the legal exposure that a lawyer would take very seriously. The resolution of the episode involves the boys revealing to Cartman that he was never actually ginger, that they had dyed his hair and drawn on his freckles while he was asleep. The moment Cartman learns this, he immediately and completely abandons the ginger supremacist position. He goes back to his original view. He is no longer ginger, so he no longer needs to lead the movement. He walks away from everything he built and everything he said as though none of it happened. The movement dissolves. A lawyer would look at that resolution with very specific interest. Because the speed with which Cartman abandoned the movement the moment it no longer served him tells you something very important about what the movement actually was. It was never about genuine belief. It was never about actually caring for the ginger kids he had gathered around him. It was a tactical adaptation. It was Cartman looking at a new situation he found himself in and finding the most effective way to gain power and protection within that situation. He built a hate movement the same way he built everything else, as a tool to serve his own interests. And when the tool was no longer needed, he put it down and walked away, leaving behind a group of children he had organized around hatred, rhetoric about eliminating a population, and a school environment that had been permanently altered by what he had said and done. A lawyer would not let him walk away so easily because the harm was done before he left the room. The original presentation caused discrimination that was real and documented. The movement he built made real threats to a real population. The speeches he gave were heard by real children who were organized around a goal of violence. The fact that Cartman personally stopped caring does not undo any of it. It just confirms that he never cared in the first place, which is itself a significant detail when a jury is deciding how seriously to take the threat he represented. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Ginger Kid's case pushes the boundaries of what the legal system is designed to handle when the person at the center of it is a child, but the law does not exist only for adults. And the harm Cartman caused to students at his school, and the organized movement he built around hatred and violent rhetoric are the kinds of things the law was specifically designed to address, regardless of who is responsible for them. And while the ginger supremacy case involved threats directed at a large population, Cartman's next appearance in a legal file involves something far more concrete, walking into a physical location with a firearm and holding the people inside at gunpoint, which removes all questions about the line between speech and action entirely. Section 7. Armed robbery and terroristic threatening. The Chinese restaurant incident, S12E8, the China problem. There is a version of dangerous behavior that the law treats one way, and there is another version that the law treats in a completely different and far more serious way. The first version is saying something threatening, making a statement, delivering rhetoric. The cases we examined in the last section lived mostly in that territory. Cartman's words, his presentations, his speeches, and the movements he organized around language. The law takes those things seriously, as we discussed. But the law reserves a different and heavier response for the moment when words are replaced by weapons. When the thing in your hand is no longer a microphone or a pamphlet, but a firearm. When the people in front of you are no longer an audience who came willingly, but hostages who have no way to leave. That is the version of dangerous behavior this section is about. And a lawyer, looking at what Cartman did in the episode known as the China problem, would be dealing with a case that belongs in an entirely different legal category from anything that came before it, because this time there was a gun in a public place, there were real people held against their will, and there was a child pulling the trigger. The episode begins with Cartman becoming convinced, after watching the opening ceremony of the 2008 Beijing Olympics on television, that China is planning to invade and take over the United States of America. The opening ceremony was, by most accounts, an extraordinarily large and carefully organized display. Thousands of performers moving in perfect coordination, enormous production, clearly the result of massive amounts of planning and resources. For most people watching, it was impressive. For Cartman, it was terrifying. He interpreted the scale and precision of the ceremony as evidence that China was preparing for something. He became genuinely convinced that an invasion was coming, that America was not ready, and that something needed to be done about it immediately. This belief was not based on any actual intelligence or any real information. It was based entirely on Cartman watching a televised ceremony and constructing a threat narrative around it in his own head. But that did not matter to Cartman, because Cartman's feelings about a situation have always been sufficient justification for whatever he decides to do next. He felt that China was a threat. He decided to act on that feeling. And the action he chose was to take a firearm into a restaurant. He recruited Butters, as he so often did when he needed a partner who would follow instructions without asking too many questions. Butters was told that this was a serious mission, that the stakes were high, and that his cooperation was essential. Butters, being Butters, went along with it. The two of them, both children, both carrying firearms, walked into a P.F. Chong's restaurant, together with the stated purpose of confronting what Cartman believed was a Chinese threat to national security. A lawyer would stop here and note something before even getting to what happened inside the restaurant. Two children walking into a public place carrying firearms is itself a serious legal event before a single word is spoken or a single action is taken inside that building. The unlawful possession of a firearm by a minor is a crime. It is a crime in every state in the country. It does not matter why the minor has the gun. It does not matter what they intend to do with it or whether their reasons feel justified to them. A child in possession of a firearm in a public setting has already committed a violation that would, in any real legal situation, result in serious consequences. And that charge is just the starting point. Everything that followed inside that restaurant builds on top of it. Once inside P.F. Chang's, Cartman took control of the situation using the gun he was carrying. He directed the staff and the customers. He used the firearm to establish that the people inside the restaurant were not free to leave or to act as they normally would. He was giving instructions. He was in charge. He was the one with the weapon. And the people inside that restaurant, the employees who had shown up to do their jobs, and the customers who had come in for a meal, were now in a situation they had not chosen and could not exit. They were being held there by a child with a gun who had decided, based on a television broadcast, that they were somehow connected to a geopolitical threat. This is false imprisonment again, but in a form that carries significantly more weight than what we examined in the Casa Bonita case. In that case, Cartman used deception to confine Butters. He told a story. The confinement was real, but the mechanism was a lie. In this case, the mechanism was a firearm. When the thing keeping you from leaving a room is a loaded weapon in the hands of someone who has already demonstrated they are willing to use it, the nature of the confinement is entirely different. The law recognizes this difference. False imprisonment carried out through the threat of physical force, particularly through the presence of a deadly weapon, is treated as a more serious version of the crime. It carries heavier potential consequences. It involves a higher level of threat to the people being held, and in this case, it happened in a public restaurant with multiple victims, which means the charge does not apply. It applies to every single person in that building who was unable to leave because of what Cartman was doing. The terroristic threatening charges arise from the same set of facts. Using a weapon to make people afraid, to control their behavior, to communicate that harm will follow if they do not comply. This is the definition of terroristic threatening. It does not require that anyone be physically harmed. It requires that a credible threat be made that causes people to fear for their safety. Every person in that restaurant who looked at a child holding a gun and understood that they could not safely leave was experiencing exactly that fear. The threat was real, the weapon was real, the inability to leave was real. Every one of those people was the victim of a terroristic threat in the legal sense, and every one of those instances adds to the charges against Cartman. Assault with a deadly weapon is another charge that attaches in this situation. In legal terms, pointing a weapon at someone or using the presence of a weapon to control their behavior is assault, even if the trigger is never pulled. The weapon does not have to fire for the assault to occur. The moment someone is made to fear for their physical safety through the use or threatened use of a deadly weapon, assault has happened. Every person in that restaurant who was directed by Cartman while he was armed was assaulted in the legal sense of that word. Again, multiply that charge by the number of people present. But the situation inside that restaurant did not stay at the level of threats. Butters, who had also come in armed, had an accidental discharge. He shot a customer. The shot hit the customer in the groin area. And then, in the chaos and panic that followed, it happened again. Butters shot the same man again. The accidental nature of what Butters did is relevant to how his personal legal exposure would be handled, but it does not reduce the seriousness of what happened. A person was shot in a public restaurant during an armed takeover that Cartman had organized and was leading. The shooting happened because Cartman brought a child with a firearm into a confined space full of people and created a situation of extreme tension and fear. When you create conditions that directly lead to a shooting, even if you were not the one who pulled the trigger, you carry legal responsibility for the outcome. A lawyer would examine Cartman's role in what happened to that customer very carefully. Cartman organized the operation. Cartman recruited Butters. Cartman was the leader of what was happening inside that restaurant. When a leader creates conditions that result in harm to victims, even if the immediate physical act was carried out by someone else, the law holds the leader responsible. This is part of why criminal conspiracy charges exist. The person who plans and directs the operation does not get to escape responsibility simply because someone else was holding the gun that fired. Cartman put Butters in that room with a weapon. Cartman created the situation. A customer was shot because of the situation Cartman created. A lawyer would make sure the jury understood exactly how that chain of responsibility worked. There is also the charge of contributing to the delinquency of a minor, which in this case applies to what Cartman did to Butters. Butters was a child. Cartman recruited him into an armed operation, gave him or arranged for him to have a firearm, brought him into a public restaurant as part of a plan to hold the people inside at gunpoint, and placed him in a situation where he ended up shooting someone. A child was used by another child to carry out a serious crime. The law has specific provisions for situations where one person encourages, directs, or enables a minor to participate in criminal activity. Cartman did all three of those things to Butters. He encouraged him by framing the operation as a serious and necessary mission. He directed him by giving instructions inside the restaurant. He enabled him by bringing him along and arming him. Every one of those elements supports a contributing to the delinquency of a minor charge that would sit alongside everything else. What makes this case particularly striking in the context of Cartman's overall legal history is the shift it represents in how he causes harm. The previous cases were personal, they were targeted. They happened in private spaces, bedrooms, backyard shelters, a school presentation. Even the gender supremacy movement, which was public in nature, was built around speech and organization. This case is different. This case involved walking into a space where ordinary people were going about their ordinary lives and turning that space into something dangerous for everyone inside it. The harm was not aimed at a specific person Cartman had a history with. It was aimed at whoever happened to be in that restaurant at that moment. Innocent bystanders became victims not because of anything they did or anything they were, but simply because of where they were when Cartman decided to take action. A lawyer building the full case against Cartman would want the jury to understand that shift clearly, because it represents an expansion of the threat Cartman poses. In the earlier cases, you could at least say that if you were not Scott Tenerman, if you were not Kyle, if you were not Butters, you were probably not a direct target. The circle of potential victims was limited to people who had a specific relationship with Cartman. The P.F. Chang's case removes that limitation. In that case, the victims were random. They were anyone in the building. And that randomness, that willingness to create danger for people with no connection to whatever Cartman was upset about, is something that changes the nature of the threat he represents and the seriousness with which the law would need to respond to it. But before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The charges in the China Program case are not subtle or complicated. They are clear, direct, and serious. Unlawful possession of a firearm by a minor, false imprisonment of multiple victims in a public setting through the use of a deadly weapon, terroristic threatening of multiple victims, assault with a deadly weapon applied to every person in that restaurant, responsibility for the shooting of a customer caused by conditions Cartman created and directed, contributing to the delinquency of a minor through the recruitment and arming of Butters. These charges presented together paint a picture of someone who had moved well beyond personal revenge and private manipulation into territory that put random members of the public in direct physical danger. And while the restaurant case shows Cartman at his most directly dangerous, the case coming next shows something in some ways even more troubling. Cartman operating not with a gun, but with a business plan, building an organization designed to profit from the suffering of the most vulnerable possible victims, in a way that showed just how far his willingness to exploit others truly extended. Section 8, Child Exploitation. The Crack Baby Athletic Association, S15E5, Crack Baby Athletic Association. If you were to sit down and try to imagine the most morally indefensible business a person could build, you would probably struggle to come up with something worse than what Eric Cartman built in the episode Crack Baby Athletic Association. Because most bad businesses, even the ones that exploit people, at least operate in a space where the victims are adults who have some level of awareness of what is happening to them. What Cartman built was different. His business model depended entirely on babies, not teenagers, not children old enough to understand their situation, infants. Babies who had been born addicted to crack cocaine because of their mother's drug use during pregnancy, who were living in a hospital going through withdrawal, who had no ability to understand anything happening around them, and who certainly had no ability to consent to being filmed, monetized, and packaged as entertainment for a paying audience. And Cartman did not stumble into this situation accidentally. He saw these babies, recognized an opportunity, and built an organization around exploiting them as efficiently and profitably as possible. A lawyer looking at what the CBAA was, how it operated, and what Cartman intended to do with it would be dealing with one of the most layered and serious cases in this entire essay. The episode begins with Cartman visiting a hospital. During this visit, he becomes aware that there are babies in the facility who were born addicted to crack cocaine. These babies, because of their addiction, have an intense physical craving for crack. They are infants in withdrawal. Their bodies are dependent on a substance they were exposed to before they were even born, through no choice of their own, and the hospital is the place where they are being cared for during this process. They are among the most vulnerable people it is possible to imagine. They are helpless in every sense of the word. They cannot speak. They cannot move independently. They cannot protect themselves or communicate distress in any meaningful way. They are entirely dependent on the adults around them to make decisions that are in their best interest. Cartman looked at these babies and saw content. He obtained crack cocaine and fashioned it into a small ball. He then placed that ball of crack into a space with the addicted babies and filmed what happened. The babies, driven by their physical addiction and withdrawal, scrambled for the crack. They fought over it in the way that infants fight over anything they desperately want, with their whole small bodies completely unaware of what they were doing or why, just responding to the physical need their addiction created. Cartman filmed all of it. He filmed babies in withdrawal fighting over the substance their bodies were craving. He captured it on video, and then he began distributing that footage and building a business model around producing more of it. He named the organization the Crack Baby Athletic Association, or the CBAA. The name itself was constructed as a deliberate reference to the NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, which governs college sports in the United States. Cartman's argument, which he delivered with the kind of confident authority he always brought to his worst ideas, was that the CBAA operated on exactly the same principles as the NCAA. The crack babies were the athletes. They were performing. They were generating entertainment that audiences wanted to watch. And just like college athletes in the NCAA, who perform and generate enormous revenue for their organizations without being paid themselves, the crack babies in the CBAA would generate revenue for the organization without receiving any compensation. Cartman genuinely presented this as a logical and defensible business model. The comparison was his justification, and the fact that he believed, or performed believing, and that this comparison was valid tells you a great deal about how Cartman's mind worked when it came to separating his own desire for profit from any consideration of who was being harmed. He recruited Kyle to help run the organization. Kyle was brought in as a business partner, given a role within the CBAA's structure, and gradually came to understand what the organization actually was and what it was doing. Cartman convinced Kyle initially that the proceeds from the CBAA were going to a charitable cause, a home for children in need. Kyle, who had a genuine conscience and would not have participated if he had known the truth from the beginning, accepted this framing and got involved. He believed the organization had a charitable purpose. He believed the money being made was going somewhere good. He was wrong about both things. Cartman was not donating the proceeds to any charitable cause. He was using the money for himself. Specifically, he was spending it on building himself a personal hot tub. While Kyle believed he was helping run a charity operation, and while the crack babies in the hospital were being filmed in their most vulnerable and painful moments, Cartman was funneling the revenue into a home improvement project for his own personal enjoyment. The charitable mission was entirely fabricated. It was a story told specifically to get Kyle's cooperation and to give the organization a respectable face that would make it easier to attract partners and investors. This is where the fraud charges begin to stack up. Cartman misrepresented the purpose of the organization to Kyle in order to obtain his participation and his skills. He misrepresented the destination of the organization's revenue to anyone who asked where the money was going. He built an entire false narrative around the CBAA's charitable mission that existed specifically to obscure what was actually happening, which was that he was profiting directly from filming addicted infants in distress. Every person who engaged with the CBAA based on that false charitable narrative was defrauded. Kyle was defrauded. Any potential donors or partners who were told the money went to charity were defrauded. The entire public face of the organization was a lie constructed to protect a business model that could not survive any honest description of what it actually was. A lawyer building the fraud case would start with the misrepresentation to Kyle. Cartman obtained Kyle's labor, his time, his business skills, and his reputation by lying to him about what the CBAA was doing with its money. Kyle provided something of real value, his participation, based on false information that Cartman deliberately gave him. That is fraud. Then you add the broader misrepresentation to anyone outside the organization who was told the proceeds went to charity. That is fraud again, applied to every person and institution that made decisions based on that false claim. But the fraud case, as serious as it is not the most serious legal problem the CBAA created. The most serious legal problem is what the organization actually was. Strip away the business language and the NCAA comparisons and the charitable cover story, and what you have is this: a person collecting addicted infants, placing a controlled substance in front of them to trigger their addiction and withdrawal, cravings, and filming the result for commercial distribution. Every part of that sentence is a serious crime. The collection and use of crack cocaine to trigger the baby's cravings is itself a criminal act. Crack cocaine is an illegal controlled substance. Obtaining it, possessing it, and using it to deliberately manipulate the behavior of addicted infants adds drug charges to the pile, but the purpose for which the drugs were used elevates everything to a different level. Cartman was not possessing crack cocaine for personal use. He was using it as a prop to cause infants to display distress and craving behavior on camera. That specific use, deploying an illegal substance to manipulate vulnerable children into producing content, is the foundation of the exploitation charges. The filming itself is where the most serious charges arise. Producing footage of children in situations of distress, suffering, or vulnerability for commercial purposes is a form of child exploitation. The specific circumstances here, babies in a medical facility going through withdrawal from an illegal substance, being deliberately triggered by placing more of that substance in front of them, with the entire event being captured on video and sold, hit every element of what exploitation laws are designed to prevent and prosecute. The babies could not consent to being filmed. They had no understanding of the camera. They had no parents present making decisions on their behalf. They had no protection in the room with them during the filming. They were entirely alone with their addiction and with Cartman's camera. The distribution of that footage compounds every charge. Producing exploitative material involving children is serious. Distributing it, putting it out into the world where it can be viewed, copied, and spread, what is an additional crime. Every instance of the footage being accessed, shared, or sold is another point of distribution. Cartman was not keeping the footage private. He was building a business model around distributing it as broadly as possible, including through a planned licensing deal with EA Sports that would have made the footage part of a major commercial product accessible to an enormous audience. The EA Sports pitch is worth examining on its own. Cartman pursued a formal business relationship with a major entertainment company, presenting the CBAA and its footage as a legitimate licensing opportunity. He sat in meetings and made a commercial case for the content his organization was producing. Every person at EA Sports who engaged with that pitch was being presented with a product built on the exploitation of addicted infants. The company ultimately did not move forward with the deal, but the attempt itself, using a professional business context to legitimize and commercialize footage of exploited children, adds a layer to the legal exposure that reaches beyond Cartman, personally, and into the realm of anyone who knew what they were looking at and kept the conversation going. Kyle eventually discovered the truth. He found out that the money was not going to charity. He found out that Cartman had been lying to him from the beginning about the purpose of the organization and the destination of its revenue. Kyle confronted Cartman about it, and Cartman's response was, in its own way, remarkable. He did not deny it, he did not apologize. He explained his reasoning. He told Kyle that the model was sound, that the comparison to the NCAA was valid, and that he had simply been running an efficient business. He presented his exploitation of addicted infants as logical. He defended the lies about charity as practical business decisions. He showed, once again, that same complete absence of guilt or remorse or any recognition that harm had been done to real beings by what he had built. A lawyer presenting this moment to a jury would not need to say very much about it. They would simply let Cartman's own defense of his actions speak for itself. Because a person who responds to being confronted with the exploitation of addicted infants by explaining the business logic is a person who has demonstrated in their own words that they understood what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. That is not confusion. That is not a child making a mistake without understanding the consequences. That is deliberate decision-making, described clearly and calmly by the person who made those decisions in a way that removes any possibility of claiming ignorance or accident. The CBAA case sits at the top of the exploitation section of Cartman's legal file for a reason. It is not just that babies were harmed, it is the totality of what was built around that harm, the fake charity. The recruited business partner who was deceived from day one, the drug use to trigger the filming, the commercial distribution network, the EA Sports deal, the hot tub funded by it all. Cartman did not stumble into a harmful situation. He constructed one from the ground up with a business plan, a partner, a revenue model, and a growth strategy. He turned the suffering of the most vulnerable people imaginable into a product, and he did it with the same energy and organization and attention to detail that he brought to every other scheme in his life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And yet, as methodical as the CBAA was, there is something important to note about how Cartman chose to run it. He worked through an organization, he had a structure, he had a CFO, he had licensing negotiations. When Cartman wanted to operate at scale, he knew how to build something institutional around his goals. And that capacity is the ability to turn individual harmful intent into an organized structure with multiple participants shows up again in the next case we are going to look at. But in that next case, Cartman did not build a business. He built something that looked like a public service. He inserted himself into an active criminal investigation, gave false information to real law enforcement officers, and sent them after people who had done absolutely nothing wrong. Section 9, Defamation and Slander. The Wendy Testerberger smear campaign, S13E13, dances with Smurfs. Every case we have examined so far in this essay has involved Cartman doing something that left a clear and visible mark. 2 people were murdered. A child was locked in a shelter. Someone was injected with a virus in the middle of the night. Babies were filmed in a hospital. A restaurant full of people was held at gunpoint. In each of those situations, the harm Cartman caused was physical or material or both. It could be pointed to. It could be documented. It had a shape and a weight that a lawyer could present to a jury and say, here is what happened, here is who it happened to, here is the damage it left behind. But the case in this section is different from all of those, because the weapon Cartman used here was not a syringe or a firearm or a fake charity. The weapon was words. Specifically, it was a sustained, public, repeated campaign of false accusations delivered through a school broadcast system, designed from the beginning to destroy the reputation of a specific person and remove her from a position of authority she had earned. And a lawyer examining what Cartman did to Wendy Testerberger through the South Park Elementary morning announcements would find that words, when used deliberately and repeatedly to cause real harm to a real person, are taken just as seriously by the legal system as almost anything else in this essay. To understand how the campaign started, you need to understand where Cartman was in the school's social structure at the beginning of this episode. Cartman was not in a position of authority. Wendy Testerberger was. Wendy was the student body president of South Park Elementary, which meant she had been elected by the student body to represent them and to lead their school government. She had earned that position through the normal process. She had campaigned. She had been chosen. She held the role. Cartman, who had no such position and no such recognition, found his way into control of the school's morning announcements, the daily broadcast that went out to every student and teacher in the building every single morning. And from the moment he had that platform, he had a decision to make about what to do with it. He decided to use it against Wendy. The specific accusation Cartman chose to build his campaign around was that Wendy Testerberger was killing Smurfs. For anyone who needs a reminder, Smurfs are the small blue cartoon characters from the Belgian comic series and later animated television show. Peaceful, friendly, small blue beings who live in a village in the forest and are beloved figures in animation history. Cartman's claim was that Wendy, as student body president, was orchestrating the killing of Smurfs. This accusation was completely false. It had no basis in anything Wendy had said or done. It was not connected to any real event or any real policy position Wendy held. It was invented by Cartman and delivered through the morning announcements as though it were a serious concern that the student body needed to be aware of. Now, on the surface, the idea of accusing someone of killing Smurfs might sound too absurd to be taken seriously as the basis of a legal case, and a lawyer handling this case would anticipate that reaction and address it directly. Because what matters in a defamation case is not whether the specific accusation sounds silly. What matters is whether a false statement was made, whether it was made deliberately or without any reasonable basis for believing it was true, whether it was communicated to other people, and whether it caused real harm to the person it was made about. All 4 of those things happened here, and a lawyer would go through each one carefully. The statement was false. Wendy was not killing Smurfs. There was no evidence she had ever harmed a Smurf or intended to. The accusation had no foundation in reality. Cartman did not have sources. He did not have witnesses. He did not have documentation. He had nothing except a microphone and a decision to use it to say damaging things about a specific person. The falseness of the statement is the first and most essential element of a defamation case, and it is the element that is most clearly present here. The statement was made deliberately. Cartman chose Wendy. He chose the accusation. He chose the morning announcements as his delivery method because they reached the widest possible audience within the school. He chose to repeat the accusations over multiple broadcasts rather than saying it once and moving on. None of this was accidental. None of it was a misunderstanding. Cartman sat down, decided what he wanted to say about Wendy, and then said it in the most public and repeated way available to him. That deliberateness is the second essential element of a strong defamation case, and it is also clearly present. The statement was communicated to other people. this is where the morning announcements become particularly significant from a legal standpoint. A defamatory statement that is only said to one other person in a private setting is taken seriously by the law, but its impact is limited. A defamatory statement broadcast to an entire school population every single morning, repeated across multiple days, heard by every student and teacher in the building, is something the law treats very differently. The scale of the communication matters. The reach of the lie matters. Cartman was not whispering about Wendy to one friend in a hallway. He was broadcasting accusations about her to the entire school through an official channel, in a format that carries institutional weight simply because it is the school's official morning broadcast. The audience was not optional. Students did not choose to listen to Cartman's accusations about Wendy. They showed up to school, the announcements came on, and the accusations were delivered to them whether they wanted to hear them or not. The statement caused real harm. This is the fourth element, and it is the one that ties the legal case to actual consequences. Wendy Testaberger was the student body president. She had a reputation within the school community. She was known as a student leader who represented her peers. Every morning that Cartman stood at that microphone and told the school that she was killing Smurfs, he was attaching a damaging and false narrative to her name and her reputation. The students who heard those accusations every morning were forming impressions of Wendy based on what Cartman was saying. The teachers who heard those announcements were hearing false claims about a student in their school. The student body that had elected Wendy was being fed daily misinformation about the person they had chosen to lead them. Reputation damage is real damage. It is measurable. Courts have recognized for a very long time that a person's reputation is something of value that can be harmed by deliberate lies, and that the person who tells those lies can be held responsible for that harm. A lawyer handling this case would also look at Cartman's broader conduct during this period beyond just the morning announcements themselves. The accusations did not stay contained to the daily broadcasts. Cartman expanded the campaign. He wrote and produced a book called Dances with Smurfs, named after the famous film Dances with Wolves, in which he elaborated on his accusations against Wendy and presented them in a published format. This is significant because it moves the defamation beyond just spoken words delivered over a broadcast system. A written publication that makes false claims about a real, named individual and presents those claims as fact is one of the clearest examples of defamation in its most serious form. Spoken defamation and written defamation are both serious, but the written form has historically been treated as particularly harmful because writing can be preserved, distributed, and read by people far beyond the original audience. Cartman put false accusations about Wendy into a book. He published that book. He distributed it. Every copy of that book that reached another person's hands was another instance of the defamation being communicated to a new audience. The motive behind the campaign is also something a lawyer would examine carefully. Cartman was not accidentally spreading false information about Wendy. He was not confused about the facts and making honest mistakes. He was running a deliberate campaign to damage Wendy's reputation specifically because she held a position of authority that he wanted or resented. He was using the platform of the morning announcements not for the legitimate purpose of informing the school community, but as a personal tool to tear down a specific individual. That motive, using a public platform to deliberately harm someone's reputation for personal or political reasons, is exactly what defamation law exists to address. There is also the harassment element of the campaign. A single false statement, even a damaging one, is treated one way by the law. But a sustained campaign of false statements, repeated daily through an official channel over an extended period of time, directed at the same person over and over again, that pattern elevates the situation. It is not just a moment of careless speech. It is a systematic effort to cause ongoing harm to one person through repeated public lies. The consistency and the repetition demonstrate intent in a way that a single incident cannot. Cartman was not making a mistake he corrected. He was not making an offhand comment he later regretted. He was running a campaign. Every morning he made a choice to get back on that microphone and say more damaging things about Wendy. Every morning was a new decision, and every morning he made the same decision. The resolution of the episode is one of the more interesting legal moments in Cartman's entire history because it involves Wendy using Cartman's own behavior against him in a way that a lawyer would recognize as genuinely clever. Wendy approached Cartman and made a deal with him. She offered him something he wanted, in the student body presidency, in exchange for him publicly admitting on the morning announcements that he had made everything up, that his accusations were false, and that none of what he had said about Wendy was true. Cartman agreed. He got on the announcements and told the school that he had fabricated the entire Smurf killing story. He admitted, on the same broadcast system he had used to spread the lies, that the lies were lies. Then Wendy revealed that she had recorded his admission. She had his own voice on tape, confessing that he had deliberately spread false information about her through the school's morning broadcast system. She had documented proof, in Cartman's own words, that the entire campaign had been knowingly false from the beginning. She used that recording to discredit him and shut down the campaign entirely. Cartman had handed her the evidence of his own defamation in exchange for a student government title, and she had walked away with something far more valuable than a title: a confession. A lawyer representing Wendy in any legal action connected to this campaign would be extremely pleased with that recording, because the hardest part of a defamation case is often proving that the person making the false statements knew they were false. In most defamation cases, the person spreading the lies will claim they believed what they were saying, that they had sources, that they were acting in good faith. Cartman's recorded admission removes all of that. He said clearly in his own voice that he had made it up. There is no room for a good faith defense when the defendant has confessed that the story was invented. The recording turns what would already have been a strong case into an essentially airtight one. Wendy Testaberger was a minor. She was a child. The person whose reputation was targeted and systematically damaged through a public broadcast campaign and a published book was a child going to elementary school. The additional legal considerations around harm to a minor, the way the law treats deliberate reputational harm to a child through a public platform, would factor into how any prosecution or civil case was handled. Wendy did not ask to be the subject of Cartman's campaign. She had done nothing to invite it. She had simply won an election and held a position of authority that Cartman chose to resent, and the response to that resentment was a sustained effort to destroy her reputation in front of her entire school community using tools that were meant to serve educational purposes. The Wendy Testaberger case matters in the context of this essay because it shows Cartman operating in a register that is entirely legal in nature without requiring a single act of physical harm. No one's body was touched, no one was locked in a room. There was no firearm, no syringe, no ground meat, just a microphone, a broadcast system, a book, and a deliberate campaign of lies. And a lawyer would look at that and recognize it as a form of harm that is just as real, just as prosecutable, and just as deserving of serious legal consequences as anything in the physical cases we have examined. Words used as weapons are still weapons. Lies told at scale to destroy a person's reputation are still crimes. And Cartman's own voice on a recording saying he made it all up is about as clear a piece of evidence as any lawyer could hope to present to a jury. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The morning announcement case reveals something about Cartman's range that is genuinely important when building a complete legal picture of who he is. He is capable of physical harm on a massive scale. He is capable of organizing movements and building businesses around exploitation. And he is also capable of sitting down in front of a microphone every morning and slowly, systematically, deliberately dismantling someone's reputation with nothing but carefully chosen words. The same mind that planned the Scott Tenerman murder and the CBAA built the Wendy Testaberger campaign. The tools were different, the harm was different, the method was entirely different, but the calculation behind it was exactly the same. And that calculation, with the willingness to cause serious harm to a real person in exchange for whatever Cartman decided he wanted that day, showed up again almost immediately in a completely different setting when Cartman walked into an active police murder investigation and began handing detectives names of innocent people to arrest. Section 10, Fraud and Obstruction of Justice. The Psychic Police Consultant S8E13, Cartman's incredible gift. There is something that happens in almost every case we have examined in this essay that works as a kind of signature. A moment where you can see Cartman assess a situation, identify what it can do for him, and then move toward that opportunity without any real consideration of who gets hurt along the way. In some cases, the opportunity was revenge. In others, it was money, or a restaurant, or a position of power. But in the case we are examining in this section, the opportunity Cartman identified was something slightly different. It was attention. It was importance. It was the feeling of being the most significant person in the room. And in order to get that feeling, Cartman inserted himself into an active police murder investigation, handed detectives the names of innocent people, and kept doing it even as those innocent people were arrested and their lives were disrupted. A lawyer looking at this case would be dealing with something that sits in a very specific legal space, one where the harm caused was not physical, not financial, but deeply real for every person who was arrested because of what Cartman said. The episode begins with Cartman attempting to fly. He constructed a set of makeshift wings, climbed up onto the roof of his house, and jumped. He was not flying, he fell. He hit the ground and was knocked unconscious, and when he woke up, he had clearly sustained a head injury from the fall. His behavior after waking was unusual enough that his mother took him to be examined. During the examination and recovery period, Cartman began claiming that the fall had given him psychic powers. He told people that the injury had unlocked an ability to see things that other people could not see, visions, impressions, information that came to him from beyond what normal senses could provide. There is a genuine question which the episode does not fully resolve about whether Cartman actually believed he had psychic powers at any point or whether he knew from the beginning that the whole thing was a performance. What the episode makes clear is that Cartman moved very quickly from claiming to have powers to actively seeking opportunities to use those claimed powers in a way that would bring him attention and recognition. And the opportunity he found was a real one. There was an active serial killer investigation happening in South Park at the time. A killer had been targeting and murdering left-handed people. The police were working the case and had not yet identified a suspect. Cartman approached them and offered his services as a psychic consultant. The South Park Police Department, which throughout the series has been depicted as not particularly sharp or careful in its investigative methods, accepted Cartman's offer. They brought him in, they sat him down with the case materials. They asked him to use his supposed psychic abilities to help them identify the killer. And Cartman, with no actual information about who the killer was, and no real psychic ability of any kind, began producing visions. The visions Cartman produced shared one consistent feature. Every person he identified as a suspect through his psychic impressions was left-handed. This was not a coincidence, and it was not genuine insight into the case. Cartman had no idea who the killer was. What he was doing was looking around the room, identifying whoever happened to be left-handed, and naming that person as someone his psychic senses were pointing to. Left-handedness was the only criteria. It was a physical characteristic that was easy to observe in anyone nearby, and since the known victims of the real killer were all left-handed, Cartman could present his targeting of left-handed people as though it were meaningful psychic pattern. Recognition. It was not. It was a child pointing at people and making things up while the police wrote down what he said. The police acted on what Cartman told them. This is the point where the legal consequences begin to multiply, because Cartman's involvement did not stay contained to a consulting room. His false psychic testimony led directly to the arrest of multiple innocent people. These were real individuals within the world of the show, left-handed people who had done absolutely nothing wrong, who were going about their lives, and who were arrested by the South Park Police Department because a child had looked at their dominant hand and told detectives that his psychic senses were drawing him toward them. A lawyer handling this case would identify the central charge as obstruction of justice. Obstruction of justice means doing something that interferes with the proper functioning of a legal investigation or legal process. It covers a wide range of behavior, but at its core, it is about taking actions that prevent law enforcement from doing their job correctly. Cartman's fake psychic testimony did exactly that. It sent the investigation in completely wrong directions. It caused detectives to spend time and resources pursuing and arresting people who had nothing to do with the murders. While those resources were being directed toward innocent left-handed people based on Cartman's fabrications, the actual killer was still free. Cartman did not just waste police time. He actively made it harder for the real investigation to move forward by filling it with false information that needed to be acted on and then untangled. That is obstruction of justice in a direct and serious form. The second charge is fraud. Cartman presented himself to the police department as a person with a genuine ability that could help their investigation. He obtained a consulting role and the authority and access that came with that role under completely false pretenses. He was not a psychic. He had no special ability. He had a head injury from falling off a roof and a willingness to stand in a room and make things up while detectives listened. Everything about his involvement with the investigation was built on a false claim about who he was and what he could do. Obtaining access to an official police investigation through false claims about your qualifications is fraud. It does not matter that no money changed hands. The access itself was something of value that Cartman obtained through deception. Then there are the consequences for the people who were arrested. Every person taken into custody because of Cartman's fake visions has a potential legal claim connected to their wrongful arrest. Being arrested for a crime you did not commit is not a neutral event. It is something that happens to your body. You are physically taken, you are held, your freedom is temporarily removed. It is something that happens to your reputation. In a community like South Park, being brought in as a suspect in a serial murder case is not information that stays private. It is something that happens to your sense of safety. The experience of being identified as a murder suspect because a child pointed at you and called it a psychic vision is genuinely distressing. Each of those arrested individuals carries their own set of potential claims flowing directly from Cartman's false testimony. A lawyer would also look at the charge of making false reports to law enforcement. In most places, providing deliberately false information to police during an active investigation is a crime on its own, separate from obstruction. Cartman was not confused or mistaken when he gave the police his fake psychic impressions. He had no basis for the things he was saying. He was generating names and impressions in the moment based on nothing real and delivering them to law enforcement as though they had evidentiary value. Doing that repeatedly across multiple sessions with detectives while innocent people were being arrested as a result is the kind of sustained false reporting that the law treats as a serious matter. What makes this case particularly troubling is the calm with which Cartman expanded his role over time. He did not present himself once, get some attention, and then step back. He kept going. He kept coming back to the police. He kept delivering new visions. He made himself a regular and seemingly essential part of the investigation. The longer he stayed involved, the more the investigation became shaped around his false input. The detectives who were supposed to be finding a real killer were instead following leads generated by a child's imagination, and Cartman was actively working to maintain his position at the center of that process because it was giving him exactly the status and recognition he had wanted when he walked in. Kyle, as he often does in situations where Cartman is causing harm and the adults around him are failing to see it clearly, was the one who recognized what was happening and tried to stop it. Kyle understood that Cartman did not have psychic powers. He understood that the arrests of innocent people were a direct result of Cartman's involvement in the case. He pushed back. He told people the truth. And he was largely dismissed, in part because the police had already committed to the narrative that Cartman's abilities were real and had built their investigative approach around that narrative. Correcting the course meant admitting that they had acted on false information repeatedly, and that is a difficult thing for any institution to do. The real killer in the episode was eventually identified and the investigation was resolved. But again, as with every case in this essay where the story reaches a resolution, the resolution does not undo the crime. The innocent left-handed people who were arrested because of what Cartman said. That happened. The investigation was sent in wrong directions repeatedly because of what Cartman said. That happened. The police department was defrauded into giving authority and access to a child with no qualifications because of what Cartman claimed about himself. That happened. A lawyer does not look at how a story ended and use the ending to evaluate whether the beginning was criminal. The beginning was criminal on its own terms. Cartman's behavior in this episode also fits into a pattern that a lawyer building a full picture of his conduct would highlight. In every major case, Cartman has shown a willingness to use whatever institutional trust is available to him as a tool. He used the school's morning announcement system to run a smear campaign. He used the Special Olympics organization's application process to enter a competition he had no right to enter. He used the television network's good faith to broadcast a fake medical condition. And in this case, he used a police department's desperation for leads in a murder case to insert himself into a position of authority he had absolutely no business holding each time the institution trusted him. Each time, that trust was the mechanism through which he caused harm. And each time, the people who paid for that misplaced trust were not Cartman. They were whoever happened to be in the way. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The psychic consultant case sits at an interesting point in Cartman's legal history because the harm it caused was entirely a product of words and false claims rather than physical action. And yet, innocent people's lives were genuinely disrupted. A real murder investigation was genuinely compromised. A police department was genuinely deceived. All of it because a child fell off a roof, woke up, and decided that the situation could be turned into an opportunity for personal recognition. The calculation was quick, the execution was confident, and the consequences for everyone except Cartman were real and lasting. And as calculated as all of that was, it still did not approach the legal complexity of what came next. When Cartman took a dispute between two children about a bet and turned it into a court order demanding something that no legal system anywhere should ever have entertained for even a moment. Section 11, Abuse of Legal Process and Sexual Harassment. The Imagination Land Court Order, S11E 10-12, Imagination Land. There is a version of the legal system that works exactly as it is supposed to work. Evidence is presented, arguments are made. A judge listens carefully and makes a decision based on what the law actually says and what the facts actually show. And then there is what happened in the Imagination Land case. Because the Imagination Land case is one of the strangest legal situations in Eric Cartman's entire history. Not because of the violence involved or the physical harm or the exploitation of vulnerable people, but because of what Cartman actually managed to get a court to do. He took a bet between two elementary school children, walked it into a real courtroom, and obtained a legal ruling that a judge was willing to sign off on, demanding that a child perform a sexual act on him. A lawyer examining this case would need to work through several layers of serious legal problems, and one of those layers involves asking hard questions not just about Cartman, but about every adult in the room who let this case get as far as it did. To understand what happened, you need to go back to where the bet started. Before the events of the Imagination Land trilogy, Cartman had made a wager with Kyle. The terms were simple and deliberately humiliating in the way that Cartman's bets with Kyle almost always were. Cartman told Kyle that if he could prove leprechauns were real, Kyle would have to perform a specific sexual act on him. Kyle, who did not believe leprechauns existed and likely considered the entire premise ridiculous, agreed to the bet. From Kyle's perspective, this was a safe agreement because the thing Cartman was claiming, that leprechauns were real, was something Kyle was confident could never be proven. The bet felt like a non-event. It felt like something that would never need to be collected on because the condition for collecting it could never be met. Then a leprechaun appeared. In the world of South Park, this is not as impossible as it sounds. The show operates in a reality where fantastical things can and do happen. In the opening events of the Imagination Land storyline, a real leprechaun appeared to the boys in the woods. Cartman had found the leprechaun first, brought the other boys to see it, and the creature was witnessed by multiple people before the much larger events of the Imagination Land trilogy took over the story. From Cartman's perspective, the condition of the bet had been met. A leprechaun had appeared. He had proven they were real. Kyle owed him what he had promised. Kyle disagreed. Kyle's position was that the broader context of everything that had happened, the portal to Imagination Land, the government involvement, the fantastical events that followed, made the original bet irrelevant. He was not going to honor it. He refused, and most people, looking at the situation, would understand Kyle's refusal as completely reasonable. A bet made between children about whether mythical creatures exist, with a prize that involves a sexual act between minors, is not the kind of agreement that any serious legal system was designed to enforce. It should have ended there. Cartman did not let it end there. He got a lawyer. He filed an actual legal case. He took what was a schoolyard argument between two children and walked it into the judicial system with the specific goal of obtaining a court order that would legally compel Kyle to honor the terms of the bet, and the case moved forward. It was heard, a judge presided over it, arguments were made, and the judge ruled in Cartman's favor, issuing a court order directing Kyle to perform the sexual act that the bet had specified. A lawyer looking at this situation would have an enormous amount to work through, and they would need to start not with Cartman, but with the court itself. Because the most alarming legal question the Imagination Land case raises is not what Cartman did. Cartman trying to use every available system to get what he wants is entirely consistent with everything else in his history. The alarming question is how a judge looked at this case and decided it was something the court should be involved in at all. The moment a case arrives in a courtroom asking a judge to compel a sexual act between two minors, every alarm in the legal system should be going off. Every protection that exists for children in the legal process should be activating. The case should not have been heard. It should have been dismissed immediately, and the adults who brought it before a judge should have faced serious questions about their own conduct. But that is the court's failure. Cartman's failure is separate, and it is serious on its own terms. The charge a lawyer would focus on first is abuse of process. Abuse of process means using the legal system for a purpose it was never designed to serve. Courts exist to resolve genuine legal disputes, to protect people's rights, to enforce legitimate agreements, and to deliver justice in situations where harm has been done. They do not exist to be used as tools to force children into sexual acts. Filing a lawsuit with that as the stated goal is not a legitimate use of the legal system. It is a perversion of it. Cartman took something that the law is supposed to protect people with and turned it into a weapon pointed directly at Kyle. That is abuse of process in one of its clearest and most serious forms. The second area a lawyer would examine is whether the underlying bet could ever be a legally enforceable agreement in the first place. For any agreement to be something the law will enforce, certain basic requirements have to be met. Both people involved have to be capable of entering into it. The thing being agreed to has to be legal. The agreement cannot go against basic standards of decency that the legal system maintains. A bet between two elementary school children that requires one of them to perform a sexual act is disqualified on multiple grounds simultaneously. Children are not considered legally capable of entering binding contracts in the way adults are, specifically because the law recognizes that children do not have the full judgment and life experience needed to understand the consequences of formal agreements. And the sexual act required by the bet's terms is something the law protects minors from regardless of whether they agreed to it or not. An agreement between children to do something that the law exists to protect children from is not a contract. It is not enforceable. It is not something a court should touch. The fact that a judge in the episode ruled otherwise represents a catastrophic failure of the judicial process, but it does not change what the law actually says about agreements of this kind. The third charge is sexual harassment. Cartman did not just mention the bet once and move on. He pursued it. He pursued it through a lawyer. He pursued it through the courts. He obtained a court order. He spent significant time and energy on a sustained effort to legally compel Kyle to perform a sexual act for his benefit. Every step of that process, the filing, the hearings, the arguments made in court, the obtaining of the order, the attempts to enforce it, was another instance of Cartman directing sexual pressure at Kyle through official channels. Sexual harassment does not require physical contact. It requires unwanted conduct of a sexual nature that is persistent and directed at a specific person. Cartman's entire legal campaign was exactly that. It was sexual in nature. It was directed specifically at Kyle. It was persistent across multiple court appearances and legal filings, and Kyle made his unwillingness to participate absolutely clear at every stage. There is also a question about the lawyer Cartman used. Any attorney who agrees to take a case asking a court to compel a sexual act between two children has accepted a case they should never have touched. Legal professionals have ethical obligations. They cannot take cases that they know are being used for improper purposes. They cannot help a client abuse the legal process. The lawyer who filed Cartman's case would be facing their own serious professional consequences for the role they played in bringing this matter before a court. A lawyer reviewing the case from the outside would note that Cartman's ability to even file this lawsuit required the cooperation of an adult legal professional who should have refused the moment they understood what the case was asking for. Kyle throughout this entire situation was a child being subjected to ongoing legal pressure to perform a sexual act. The psychological impact of having a court case filed against you with that specific demand, of watching it move through hearings, of being present when a judge issued an order, is not a neutral experience. It is deeply distressing. It is the kind of sustained targeting of a minor through institutional channels that the law exists to prevent. And yet, because of a series of failures by every adult in the process, it happened. The court heard the case. The order was issued. Kyle faced a legal document telling him he had to do what Cartman wanted. The resolution of the Imagination Land trilogy eventually overtook the bet storyline, and the matter was ultimately not fully resolved in the way Cartman wanted. The larger events of the Imagination Land plot, the government, the bomb, the saving of imaginary characters, consumed the narrative, and the bet became something the story moved past rather than something with a clean legal conclusion. But a lawyer would not accept the narrative convenience of the story moving on as a substitute for legal accountability. The case was filed, the order was issued, the process was abused. Kyle was subjected to ongoing sexual harassment through legal channels. All of those things happened regardless of whether the story gave them a tidy ending. The Imagination Land case is unique in Cartman's legal history because it is the only case where he used the legal system itself as the instrument of harm. In every other situation, the legal system is the thing responding to what Cartman did. Here, the legal system was the tool. He recruited it, he fed it paperwork, he stood in front of a judge and made arguments, and walked out with an order in his hand. The harm was not done around the legal system or despite it, it was done through it. And that is a form of abuse that the law takes particularly seriously, because when the legal system is turned against the people it is supposed to protect, the damage done goes beyond the individual case. It shakes people's trust in the entire process. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The 11 cases examined in this essay have shown Cartman operating in almost every mode of harm that the legal system knows how to address: murder, false imprisonment, deliberate infection, exploitation of a sleeping child, medical fraud, hate organization, armed robbery, child exploitation, defamation, obstruction of justice, and now the abuse of the court system itself. Each case stands alone. Each one is serious enough on its own to define a person's legal history entirely, but all of them belong to the same person. And the final case in this essay brings all of that history together because it involves Cartman at the largest scale he ever operated, not targeting one person, not defrauding one organization, but directing a force capable of mass destruction toward entire cities while also physically assaulting his own teammates and locking them in his room. Section 12. Conspiracy to cause mass destruction. The Coon and Cthulhu S14 E11-13 Coon 2 Hindsight/Mysterion Returns /Coon vs. Coon and Friends. Every case in this essay has asked the same basic question in different ways. How much harm can one person cause, and what does the legal system do about it? We have looked at 2 murders. We have looked at false imprisonment, deliberate infection, the exploitation of infants, armed robbery, organized hatred, defamation, obstruction of justice, and the abuse of a courtroom. Each of those cases was serious. Each of them would be in the real world, the kind of thing that defines a person's entire legal history. But all of them, even the most severe among them, shared one common limitation. They were contained. The harm had edges. It happened to specific people in specific places at specific times. Even the ginger supremacy movement, which threatened an entire population, remained within the boundaries of a small Colorado town and a group of elementary school children. What we are examining in this final section has no such boundaries, because in the Coon and Friends trilogy, Eric Cartman did not target a person or a school or a restaurant or an organization. He targeted cities. He directed a force capable of ending civilization toward populated areas and civilian gatherings for reasons that would not satisfy a single person on any jury anywhere in the world. And he did it while also physically assaulting his own allies and locking them in his room. A lawyer building the final chapter of Cartman's legal file would need to reach for a category of charges that most criminal cases never come close to touching. To understand this case, you first need to understand who and what Cthulhu is within the world of the show. Cthulhu is a creature drawn from the horror fiction of author H.P. Lovecraft, an ancient, enormously powerful entity that exists outside of normal understanding, capable of causing destruction on a scale that dwarfs anything a human being could produce. In the South Park universe, during this trilogy, Cthulhu became real and present in the world. He emerged and his presence caused widespread fear and chaos. He was not a weapon in any ordinary sense. He was not something that could be aimed and fired like a gun, or directed and managed like an organization. He was a force of nature given physical form, ancient and incomprehensibly powerful, operating at a scale that made everything else in Cartman's history look small by comparison. Cartman, operating as his superhero alter ego the Coon, found a way to connect with Cthulhu. He approached the creature with a gentleness and persistence that eventually produced a response. Cthulhu, this ancient and terrifying force, became fond of Cartman in the way the episode depicted, following him, being guided by him, responding to his direction. Cartman had attached himself to the most destructive force in the show's universe and gained influence over where it went and what it did, and the moment he had that influence, the question became what he was going to do with it. The answer was not to protect people. The answer was not to solve any genuine problem or address any real threat. The answer was personal. Cartman used Cthulhu to settle scores and remove things from the world that he personally found irritating or offensive. He directed Cthulhu to attack and destroy San Francisco. He directed Cthulhu to a Justin Bieber concert and had the ancient entity descend on the gathered crowd. He used the most catastrophically powerful force in the South Park universe as a tool for personal preference, pointing it at things he disliked and watching them be destroyed. A lawyer building this case would spend considerable time on what directing a destructive entity toward a populated city actually means in legal terms. San Francisco is a city with a real population. A Justin Bieber concert is a gathering of real people who showed up to see a performance and had no idea that anything dangerous was coming. The people in those locations had not done anything to Cartman. They had no relationship with him. They had no history with him. They were simply present in places that Cartman had decided for his own reasons deserved to be destroyed. And Cartman, through his relationship with Cthulhu, made the decision to send destruction toward those places and toward all the people in them. The charge that applies here is one of the most serious in the entire legal system. Directing any force, a weapon, a group of people, a destructive entity, toward civilian populations with the knowledge that it will cause mass casualties is conspiracy to commit mass destruction. It is in the same family as terrorism. It is the category of crime that legal systems reserve for actions so severe and so indiscriminate that ordinary criminal charges are not sufficient to describe them. When the target is not a person or a building, but a city and everyone in it, the law reaches for its most serious tools. And Cartman's use of Cthulhu was not an accident and was not defensive. He identified a target, directed Cthulhu toward it, and watched the destruction happen. He made each of those decisions deliberately, calmly, and for reasons that had nothing to do with any genuine threat to himself or anyone else. The San Francisco attack and the concert attack are the headline charges. But a lawyer would also carefully examine something else that happened during this trilogy that is separate from the Cthulhu situation and belongs to its own section of the file. Because while the Cthulhu direction was happening, Cartman was also dealing with his own teammates in the Coon and Friends group in a way that produced its own serious criminal consequences. Coon and Friends was the superhero group that Cartman had formed along with several of his classmates. The members included Kenny, operating as his superhero persona Mysterion, along with other South Park kids who had built their own identities around the idea of being heroes who helped their community. Cartman was the self-appointed leader. He believed the group existed to serve his vision and his goals. When the other members began making decisions he disagreed with, when they operated independently of his direction, when they pursued their own ideas about what the group should be doing, Cartman decided to handle the situation in the most direct way he could think of. He physically attacked them. He scratched their faces. He used his hands and his nails to cause physical harm to each of his teammates as a way of punishing them for not following his lead. This was not metaphorical. It was not a heated argument that got out of hand in a way nobody intended. Cartman went around and scratched the faces of the children who were supposed to be his allies, deliberately and with the specific purpose of hurting them and making clear that there were consequences for not doing what he wanted. The physical assault of multiple people in a group context, carried out by a single person as a form of punishment and control, is assault. It applies once for every person who was scratched. Multiple victims means multiple counts, and the fact that the victims were children who were also supposed to be Cartman's allies makes the nature of the violence particularly notable. He hurt the people on his own side because they were not obedient enough. After the scratching, Cartman imprisoned the members of Coon and Friends. He locked them in his room. He held them there against their will. This is false imprisonment again, but in a context that is slightly different from the Casa Bonita situation. In the Butters case, the false imprisonment was carried out through deception. Cartman used a lie to keep Butters confined. In this case, the imprisonment was more direct. He physically controlled the situation and kept his teammates locked in his room as a consequence for their disagreement with him. Multiple victims, confined against their will, by the same person who was simultaneously directing an ancient destructive entity toward civilian populations. A lawyer presenting this case to a jury would want them to understand that the assaults and the imprisonment were not separate events that happened to occur during the same story. They were part of the same operating pattern. Cartman wanted control. When Cthulhu gave him control over cities, he used it. When his own teammates refused to give him control over the group, he took it by force and then removed their ability to resist by locking them away. The full charge list in the Coon and Friends case is the longest in this entire essay. Conspiracy to commit mass destruction for directing Cthulhu toward San Francisco and the concert. Multiple counts of assault for the scratching of each teammate. Multiple counts of false imprisonment for holding the group in his room. And wrapped around all of it, the same pattern that has been present in every single case from the very beginning. Deliberate, calculated decisions made with full awareness of the harm they would cause, made in service of what Cartman wanted at that particular moment, with complete indifference to the people who would suffer as a result. There is something worth noting about how Cartman's relationship with Cthulhu ended. Cthulhu was eventually redirected away from Cartman's influence. The dynamic shifted, the ancient creature was no longer following him. And Cartman, without that power, returned to being a child in South Park with no extraordinary abilities and no cosmic weapon at his disposal. He lost the thing that had made him, for a brief period, capable of causing harm at a truly incomprehensible scale, and the loss did not appear to produce regret or reflection in him. It produced frustration at losing control. Because for Cartman, the destruction of San Francisco and the attack on a concert full of people were not things he looked back on with horror. They were things he had wanted to do and had done. The loss he felt was the loss of the tool, not any grief for the people the tool had been used against. A lawyer presenting the complete picture of Eric Cartman's legal history to a jury would end with this case for a reason. Not because it is the most personal case in the file. The Scott Tenerman case holds that position. Not because it is the most calculated. The CBAA and the Tourette's fraud were built with more deliberate planning. But because the Coon and Friends case shows where all of that personal cruelty, all of that calculation, all of that complete absence of consideration for other people leads when it is given access to unlimited power. Every other case in this file was Cartman at human scale. This case is Cartman at every scale at once. And the question the jury would be left with, the question that sits at the end of every case in this file, stacked one on top of another until the pile reaches the sky, is not simply what sentence Eric Cartman deserves. It is something larger and harder than that. It is whether any sentence, any legal consequence, any punishment the system could produce would mean anything to a person for whom the suffering of others has never once, across an entire lifetime of causing it, registered as a reason to stop. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.